On the freezing night of the 3rd of January 1804, 22-year-old Thomas Millwood sat inside a crowded pub in Hammersmith, England, feeling thoroughly annoyed. Normally, Thomas was an upbeat, social young man. He worked hard as a local bricklayer, and every day after his grueling shift, he would meet his friends at this tavern to drink ale, share stories, and laugh. But tonight, everything irritated him. As his friends droned on about the latest drama gripping their town, Thomas snapped. He slammed his pewter beer mug onto the table with a loud crash. The pub went dead silent. Realizing he had overreacted, Thomas muttered an embarrassed apology, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the exit. Just as he opened the door, his friends called out with genuine concern, "Hey, be careful you call it there, Thomas." Thomas rolled his eyes, muttered a dismissive, "Yeah, okay," and stepped into the bitter winter night. Thomas decided to walk to his parents' house nearby to warm up by the fire before meeting his wife. She worked late hours at a local estate, and Thomas always escorted her home safely. As he turned on to Black Lion Lane, the streets were entirely deserted. This was unusual for Hammersmith, a bustling town of 45,000 residents just outside London. Lately, however, a suffocating fear had settled over the community. For 2 months, a string of bizarre sightings and violent late-night attacks had left residents terrified to step outside after dark. Thomas thought the panic was absolute nonsense. He had done his best to ignore the gossip, but escaping it was becoming impossible. As he rounded a dark corner, he nearly collided with 2 men walking in the opposite direction. Startled, Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but one of the men shrieked, "Get back!" One man brandished a heavy wooden club, while the other gripped a pistol in his waistband. Thomas immediately threw his hands up to show he was not a threat. Relaxing their stance, the man with the club warned, "It's dangerous to be out here alone. You shouldn't be out by yourself." Before Thomas could reply, they hurried past him into the shadows. Thomas shook his head, thoroughly annoyed by the encounter. Reaching his parents' house, he found the front door securely bolted. He knocked loudly, and a moment later his sister Anne approached from the other side. "Who's there?" she called out anxiously. "It's me, Anne," Thomas replied. "Step back from the door so I can see you through the peephole," she insisted. Thomas groaned, but complied. Once Anne verified his identity, she unlocked the door, pulled him inside, and immediately locked it behind him. Her very first question was, "Well, did you see it?" Thomas instantly regretted coming. It didn't matter where you went in Hammersmith, everyone was obsessed with the attacks. The townspeople were absolutely convinced that a malevolent ghost was haunting them. The hysteria had begun 2 months earlier when a white figure was spotted in the church cemetery. It was soon discovered that the figure was just the butcher's son dressing up in women's clothing as a prank. But the panic didn't stop. A week later, a chimney sweep claimed he saw a phantom vanish into the graveyard dirt. Then, the physical attacks began. A pregnant woman was choked by a pale figure before escaping. A carriage driver was confronted by a creature with horns, causing him to abandon his horses and passengers. By late December, terror gripped the entire town. Thomas tried to convince his family that a ghost couldn't physically choke people, it had to be a human prankster using the rumors as a cover. But logic failed when a heavily pregnant woman died following an assault. She claimed a figure in a white robe and a pointed hat rose from the ground and grabbed her. She fainted from terror and died shortly after being found by neighbors. Following her death, the town offered a massive financial reward to anyone who could capture or kill the Hammersmith ghost. Citizens formed armed vigilante groups, completely consumed by panic. Inside his parents' home, Thomas sat by the fire, drifting off to sleep. Looking at the frost on the window, he dreaded going back into the freezing cold. He suggested to Anne that he might just sleep on the floor and let his wife walk home alone. Anne exploded. "Are you out of your mind?" she shouted. "She will be the next victim of the ghost. Get out there and protect your wife." Thomas groaned, grabbed his jacket, and stepped back into the night. His frustration boiled over. He decided that if he ran into this ghost, he would sprint straight at him and beat him up to prove to the entire town that it was just a man. Marching briskly down Black Lion Lane, Thomas noticed a massive bush on the sidewalk. He stopped and squinted. Behind the branches, a dark figure was crouched low, trying to hide. Thomas's heart raced with adrenaline. This is the prankster, he thought. Without hesitation, Thomas balled his hands into fists and launched into a full sprint toward the bush. At that exact moment, Anne was looking out her window and heard a loud, agonizing male scream. Terrified that her brother was being attacked, she bolted outside. Minutes later, a large posse of men burst out of the pub Thomas had left earlier. They were led by Francis Smith, the town's mild-mannered tax collector. Francis looked completely unhinged, out of breath, and terrified. He led the armed men down Black Lion Lane, where they suddenly froze. Lying in the dirt road was a motionless body. Crouched over the corpse was a dark, shadowy figure. As the posse approached, the figure whipped its head around and let out a blood-curdling shriek of grief. The night watchman rushed forward, tackling the dark figure to the ground. The rest of the men ran to the body, assuming they had found the ghost's latest victim. They were tragically wrong. The person hiding behind the bush had been Francis Smith. He wasn't the ghost, he was a terrified citizen waiting to ambush the spirit for the reward. The tragedy came down to Thomas's clothing. As a bricklayer, Thomas wore his work uniform, stark white linen trousers, a white jacket, and a white apron. To Francis, crouching in the dark and primed to see a phantom, a figure in all white charging at him out of the shadows, was a nightmare. Panicking, Francis raised his shotgun and fired. The blast hit Thomas squarely in the face, killing him instantly. The monstrous dark figure cradling Thomas's body was just his sister Anne, wearing a dark shawl, weeping over her dead brother. The tragedy shocked England. On the 11th of January 1804, Francis Smith was tried for murder. The jury, knowing he acted out of genuine terror, tried to find him guilty of manslaughter. However, the judge ruled that mistake of fact was no defense for murder. Smith was sentenced to hang. Recognizing the lack of malice, King George III intervened 5 weeks later, commuting Smith's sentence to just 1 year of hard labor. Soon after, the town's shoemaker confessed to being the true Hammersmith ghost. He had used the disguise to terrify his apprentices as revenge for telling scary ghost stories to his children. The case was debated for over 150 years. Ultimately, the tragic death of Thomas Millwood led to modern self-defense laws, establishing that a person is legally permitted to use force if they honestly and reasonably believe they are in imminent danger, even if they are completely mistaken. On the freezing night of the 3rd of January 1804, a 22-year-old man named Thomas Millwood sat inside a crowded neighborhood pub in Hammersmith, England, feeling completely and utterly annoyed. Under normal circumstances, Thomas was a remarkably upbeat, cheerful, and highly social person. He worked hard as a local bricklayer, and basically every single day after his grueling physical shift ended, he would head straight to this local tavern to meet up with his closest friends. Together, they would have some drinks, share rowdy stories, and laugh away the exhaustion of the day. It was their daily ritual, and it was always a great time. But tonight, it was like everything under the sun annoyed Thomas. He found himself especially irritated by his friends. As they droned on and on, obsessing over the current drama going on in their small town, Thomas felt a hot surge of impatience rising in his chest. He finally just had enough. Before he could stop himself, he stood up abruptly and slammed his heavy pewter beer mug down onto the wooden table with a resounding crash. Right away, Thomas knew he had severely overdone it. The moment the mug struck the wood, the entire pub went deadly silent. The chatter died, his friends all stopped talking mid-sentence, and absolutely everybody in the room turned to look directly at him. Feeling a wave of embarrassment, Thomas kind of muttered a hasty apology and then quickly grabbed his heavy winter coat. He stood up and just began walking toward the exit, desperately wanting to leave the pub. The tavern remained totally silent as he walked across the floor. Then, right as he was about to step out the door and into the street, his friends finally broke the tense silence. They called out to him, their voices laced with genuine anxiety, and said, "Hey, be careful out there." Thomas didn't turn around to look back. He just rolled his eyes, muttered a dismissive, "Yeah, okay," and then he went outside into the bitter, biting cold. Thomas decided he would walk over to his parents' house, which was located not very far away. His plan was simple. He would just sit by their fireplace and warm up for a little bit before he had to go back out later that night to meet up with his wife. His wife worked incredibly long hours at a local estate, and she often worked quite late into the night. Whenever she worked late, Thomas made it a strict rule to walk to her workplace, meet her when her shift ended, and personally escort her back home to ensure she was safe. That was exactly what he was planning on doing tonight, but he had some time to kill beforehand. As Thomas began walking briskly down Black Lion Lane, he noticed that, per usual, he was basically one of the only people outside. Hammersmith used to be a very friendly, lively, and bustling place. It was home to roughly 45,000 residents and was located right on the prosperous outskirts of London. In fact, it was so beautiful that lots of rich people liked to go there just to vacation. But recently, the entire atmosphere of the town had completely changed. There had been a string of increasingly bizarre late-night sightings and violent encounters or attacks, as the frantic townspeople were calling them. This ongoing phenomenon had all the residents completely on edge, to the agonizing point where people were flat out refusing to go outside after the sun went down. Now, Thomas thought the entire situation was totally ridiculous. In his mind, people were completely overreacting to shadows and rumors. Because of this, he had been doing his absolute best to ignore the endless drama going on in town, but it was getting harder and harder to do that. As Thomas rounded a dark corner on the lane, the reality of the town's panic smacked him right in the face. He nearly walked directly into two men who were walking the opposite direction. When Thomas looked up to apologize for almost colliding with them, one of the men shrieked in absolute terror, "Get back!" Thomas blinked in shock. In the dim light, he saw that the man who shouted was holding a heavy wooden club tightly in his hand, raising it defensively. The other guy had a loaded pistol tucked into his waist, and his hand was clamped firmly onto the pistol grip, ready to draw and fire. Thomas instinctively threw both of his hands up into the air to show he was completely unarmed and was not a threat. At that point, seeing that he was just a regular young man, the first man slowly lowered his club, and the other guy took his hand off his pistol grip. One of them looked at Thomas, his voice trembling, and said, "Hey, it's dangerous to be out here alone." "You should not be out here by yourself." Before Thomas could even say anything back to them, the two men quickly walked past him, quickened their pace, and completely disappeared around the dark corner. By now, Thomas was only a few houses away from his parents' home. He just kind of brushed off the unsettling incident, speed-walked the rest of the way, and mentally cursed the two men under his breath for their ridiculous, paranoid warning about how dangerous it was out here. A minute later, Thomas arrived at his parents' house. He walked up to the front door, expecting it to be open, because normally his parents kept the door unlocked for family. But when he tried the knob tonight, it was firmly locked. He knocked loudly. A second later, he heard the cautious footsteps of his sister Anne coming toward the door inside the house. She called out warily through the thick wood, "Who's there?" Thomas groaned. "It's me, Anne." But apparently, just hearing his voice was not enough to satisfy her. Anne called back through the door, "Well, I don't know if it's really you, so back up so I can see your whole person through the peephole." Thomas rolled his eyes in exasperation, but he did exactly what his sister asked. He stepped back several feet into the cold street and allowed her to inspect his entire body through the small viewing hole. At that point, he finally heard Anne fumbling frantically with the heavy iron lock. The door was unlocked, and she opened it up. Thomas stepped inside, and his sister immediately shut and locked the door securely behind him. Her very first question to Thomas wasn't a greeting. She just looked at him and asked, "Well, did you see it?" Thomas immediately wished he had not come to his parents' house at all. He had walked all this way specifically to avoid talking about this stupid, exhausting topic, but he quickly realized that if he had gone back to his own house, he likely would have gotten the exact same question from his mother-in-law, who lived with him and his wife. The truth was, it didn't really seem to matter where you went in Hammersmith or who you talked to. The conversation was always going to be exactly the same. It was always going to be about these late-night attacks, because the people of Hammersmith were absolutely, unshakably convinced that these crimes were being committed by a literal ghost. The entire mass hysteria had started about 2 months earlier, in November, when somebody spotted a mysterious pale figure lurking ominously in the church cemetery. Thomas firmly believed the panic should have stopped right then and there, because only a couple of days after that initial sighting, the truth was figured out. It was discovered that the figure was actually just the local butcher's son. He had just been dressing up in women's clothes and walking around in the cemetery purely as a prank to scare his friends. It was a joke. A prank. That was it. But the terror in town did not go away. A week after this first weird sighting, there was another, more sinister sighting in the exact same cemetery. A local chimney sweep claimed he saw someone walking around in the graveyard who literally disappeared straight into the ground. Admittedly, a lot of the more level-headed people in Hammersmith brushed that second sighting off as just pure imagination and hysteria. But it was right after this second sighting that the so-called attacks began in town. Late one night, a resident was walking past the cemetery perimeter when something rushed up silently behind them and began violently choking them. This resident was somehow able to break free from the grip and run away to safety, but as they fled, they turned and got a clear look at whatever was attacking them. They described the assailant as a terrifying phantom. Shortly after that, a local carriage driver was navigating his vehicle past the cemetery when he had to get out for some reason. Suddenly, a horrific creature with literal horns on its head came charging out of the darkness and confronted the driver. The driver was so overwhelmed by fear that he turned and ran away on foot, completely abandoning his 8 horses and his 16 passengers to fend for themselves. By late December, there had been so many more of these strange attacks and weird sightings that basically every single person in Hammersmith, save for Thomas, was totally gripped by a paralyzing fear. As terror spread like wildfire across the town, Thomas had repeatedly attempted to convince his wife, his mother-in-law, and his family that there was just no physical way this was a real ghost. He argued constantly that it was nothing more than people's paranoia and their imaginations running wild. But Thomas's logical theory was put into serious question when just a few days earlier, somebody actually died following one of these attacks. And it wasn't just anyone. A pregnant woman had died. The woman had been walking alone near the church cemetery at about 10 o'clock at night when something in the graveyard rose up out of the ground, rushed over to her, and grabbed onto her tightly. She barely had time to turn and look, catching only a glimpse of a white flowing robe and a long, pointed white hat before she fainted from sheer terror. When she woke up again, she was inside a neighbor's house, surrounded by worried citizens who had found her passed out in the dirt and carried her inside. She came to, but she was only able to choke out the terrifying story of what had happened to her, the story of the ghost attack, before her body gave out and she died. Following the tragic death of this pregnant woman, the town of Hammersmith officially offered a massive financial reward for anybody who could capture or kill the entity, which was now being dubbed the Hammersmith Ghost. The night watchmen began doing extra patrols every single hour. In fact, those 2 men Thomas had bumped into earlier, the guy with the club and the guy with the gun, were on their own citizen patrol. The ghost, and how to capture or kill it, was basically the only thing people in Hammersmith wanted to talk about. It was what was being discussed at the pub by his friends when Thomas got so mad that he slammed his cup down and left. To Thomas, the very idea of capturing or killing a ghost made absolutely no sense, because ghosts simply aren't real. By this point, the butcher's son had even come forward publicly and said, "Look, I didn't do any of these other attacks. That's not me. I only did the very first one." He even had a rock-solid alibi to prove it. But to Thomas, this didn't rule out that the ghost was a physical person. To Thomas, it just meant there was somebody else in town who was actively copying the butcher's son's prank, except they had obviously taken the jokes way too far because they had gotten someone killed. At about 10 o'clock, Thomas was sitting comfortably inside his parents' house by the fire, just beginning to doze off. As he sat there in the warmth, he thought to himself how little he wanted to go back out into the freezing cold night just to walk with his wife all the way back home. He honestly would have much rather just stayed right here, slept on the floor for the night, and let his wife walk home on her own. But when he floated this lazy idea to his sister Anne, who was standing nearby, she completely exploded on him. "Are you kidding me?" she shouted. "You're going to let your wife walk home alone in this terrifying environment? She's going to be the next victim of the Hammersmith ghost. Get out there right now and protect your wife." Thomas held up his hands defensively. Okay, he muttered. He reluctantly got up, grabbed his jacket, and walked back outside into the freezing air. The moment Thomas stepped outside, he felt a massive wave of frustration. He was feeling so intensely annoyed at the current situation that a reckless, angry thought formed in his head. You know what? If I run into that stupid Hammersmith ghost tonight, the person disguised as a ghost, I am going to bum rush them and beat them up. It will prove to this entire cowardly town, once and for all, that there was never any ghost, and that it was just a regular person the whole time. Fueled by anger, Thomas began walking briskly down the road. He turned onto Black Lion Lane, and almost immediately his eyes caught something. Off to the side of the road, right on the sidewalk, was a massive bush. Thomas could have sworn that behind this bush there was something or someone crouched down low, like they were deliberately trying to hide in the shadows. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks. He squinted hard through the darkness in the direction of the bush. As he watched, he saw a distinct movement just enough to confirm to him that there was absolutely a human being hiding back there. Suddenly, everything clicked perfectly for Thomas. That must be the person pretending to be the ghost, he thought. That's the prankster. That's the murderer. There they are. Without a single second of hesitation, Thomas balled up his fists, locked his eyes on the bush, and launched into a full-blown sprint directly toward the hidden person. At virtually the exact same time, back inside the house, Anne was standing near the window, looking out roughly in the direction that her brother had gone. Suddenly, cutting through the quiet night air, she heard a loud, agonizing scream that sounded distinctly like a man. She couldn't see her brother from where she stood, but a horrific thought hit her. Oh my God, that's coming from the exact area where he went. What if he's getting attacked by the ghost? Terrified for his life, she bolted out the front door and ran into the darkness. Just a couple of minutes after that, a massive, rowdy posse of men came tumbling out of the very pub where Thomas had been drinking earlier that night. They came stumbling out into the cold, but they were not being led by the night watchman, even though a watchman was present in the crowd. Instead, they were being led by the town's mild-mannered tax collector, a man named Francis Smith. Francis looked completely disheveled, entirely out of breath, and frantic. He did not look at all like the type of guy who would be leading a big angry posse, but here he was. He led the men down the road at a full run, and they turned the corner onto Black Lion Lane. The moment the posse looked down the lane, they stopped dead in their tracks. Lying right in the middle of the dirt road was a human body, and it didn't appear to be moving at all. Crouched directly over the body was a dark, shadowy figure, hunched low over the torso. The figure suddenly turned, looked straight at the approaching posse, and let out an unbelievable, blood-curdling shriek. The men in the posse backed up in pure terror, completely unsure of what to do. But the night watchman suddenly broke ranks. He began sprinting directly at the creature that was perched over the body. He threw his weight forward, tackled the figure hard onto the ground, and pinned them tightly to the earth. At the same time, seeing that the threat was pinned, the rest of the posse rushed over to the body in the road to see if the victim was still alive and if there was any way they could help. But unfortunately, the moment they looked down at the body, they could tell the person was already dead. The posse genuinely believed they had just discovered the latest tragic victim of the Hammersmith ghost, and that they had successfully captured the ghost itself, the black creature the watchman had tackled onto the ground. But they were completely wrong. When Thomas had rounded the corner onto Black Lion Lane and looked into that bush, the figure moving around really was a living human being. It was Francis Smith, the tax collector. However, Francis was not hiding behind that bush because he was pretending to be the Hammersmith ghost, which was what Thomas had assumed when he charged him. Instead, Francis was hiding behind that bush because he was actively laying in wait for the ghost. He was hoping the spirit would walk past his hiding spot so he could run out, capture or kill it, and claim the town's reward. Basically, Francis was trying to do the exact same thing Thomas was doing. The only difference was that Francis actually believed in the ghost, and Thomas did not. It was just Thomas's horrific bad luck that, on that specific night, he had chosen to wear his everyday work clothes. Because he was a bricklayer, his uniform consisted of a stark, all-white jacket, white trousers, and a white apron. To Francis, who was crouching behind the bush, terrified and desperately waiting for a phantom dressed in white robes, seeing a figure in all white suddenly sprint out of the darkness directly at him was his worst nightmare. When the two men spotted each other, they both attacked. Except Francis was armed with a shotgun. As Thomas ran up to the bush to punch him in the face, Francis panicked, raised his gun, and pulled the trigger. The blast hit Thomas directly in the face and throat, killing him instantly. But even after shooting him, Francis had absolutely no idea he had just killed a real person. He was so incredibly jacked up on adrenaline and terror that he thought he had shot the actual ghost, but he was too afraid to check the body alone. He ran straight to the pub, gathered the posse, and said, "Hey, I got the ghost!" "Come on!" When they all ran back to Black Lion Lane, Thomas's sister Anne had already made it to the scene. She was the creature crouched over the body, screaming out of pure, unadulterated grief. She had just found her dead brother and was reacting to the horror when the watchman mistakenly tackled her to the ground. Luckily, the posse quickly realized their mistake, and Anne was not harmed. On the 11th of January, 1804, Francis Smith was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. However, recognizing the total lack of malice and the genuine element of terror involved, the King of England intervened 5 weeks later, pardoning Francis and shortening his sentence to just 1 year of hard labor. The true identity of the subsequent Hammersmith ghost attacks was later revealed to be the town's shoemaker, who confessed to the crimes out of guilt following Thomas's murder. He admitted he only did it to terrify his apprentices as revenge because they had scared his own children with ghost stories. The legal fallout of the Hammersmith ghost incident was fiercely debated in courts for more than 150 years. Ultimately, this bizarre tragedy led to a foundational, modern-day legal ruling which states that a person is legally allowed to use force in self-defense if they truly and reasonably believe they are in imminent danger, even if they are completely mistaken about the danger they actually face. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. We often think of the most dangerous places on Earth as being far away, hidden in the depths of the ocean, inside active volcanoes, or atop frozen, windswept mountain peaks. But the truth is much more unsettling. Sometimes, the most deadly places are the ones we walk into every single day without a second thought. They are places of worship, weekend getaways where we go to swim, or the workplaces where we earn a living to support our families. We step into these spaces trusting that they are safe, completely unaware that a series of small, silent failures has already transformed them into lethal traps. All it takes is one ordinary action, one minor oversight, and a normal afternoon turns into a tragedy. Today, we are going to look at 3 moments when people entered spaces they thought they knew, only to find themselves caught in situations that would claim their lives in the most unexpected ways. Our first story begins in the city of Waco, Texas, on a warm Sunday morning. The date was the 30th of October 2005, and the clock had just struck 10:30 inches the morning. Inside the University Baptist Church, a vibrant and close-knit community had gathered for their weekly service. At the front of the church, standing on the stage, was a 33-year-old pastor named Kyle Lake. Kyle was not your typical formal minister. He was a young, energetic, and highly educated man who had been leading this church for the past 7 years. Under his guidance, the congregation had grown dramatically, evolving into a lively group made up mostly of college students and young families who were drawn to his progressive and relatable approach to faith. Kyle was known for his quick wit, his warm smile, and his habit of playing lighthearted pranks on his congregation, even in the middle of a serious sermon. He had a way of making everyone feel welcome and comfortable. On this particular morning, Kyle's own family was right there with him. His wife was sitting in the front row watching him with pride, while his 3 young children were across the hall attending the kids' Bible study. Kyle had just finished delivering a powerful, uplifting sermon, and the energy in the room was joyful and light. But now, it was time for the main event of the morning. Kyle was about to perform a special ceremony to welcome a new member, a young woman, into the church family. For Kyle, this was the most meaningful part of his job. He loved these moments, and the entire congregation of about 800 people always got behind the ceremony with great enthusiasm. Kyle called the young woman up to the stage. She smiled, walked up the steps, and stood near him as he introduced her to the crowd. Then, as part of the ritual, Kyle walked over to the very center of the stage where the ceremony was designed to take place. He was about to call the woman over to join him when there was a sudden, minor malfunction. The malfunction itself was not a big deal at all. It was just a small technical glitch that forced Kyle to pause for a second. But the problem was, his lapel microphone, which was clipped to his shirt, had suddenly stopped working. Because the church sanctuary was massive and cavernous, sound did not travel well, and Kyle knew that the 800 people in the audience would not be able to hear him if he continued without amplification. He needed to find a quick fix so he could keep the ceremony moving. He looked around and saw a metal stand holding a handheld microphone resting just within arm's reach at the edge of the stage. He realized he did not even need to step away to get it. He could just reach out, grab the microphone, and continue. However, what Kyle did not know was that a second, far more dangerous malfunction had occurred, either at that exact moment or just before. And this was a malfunction that was completely invisible to everyone in the room. The special ceremony Kyle was performing that morning was a baptism, and the area in the center of the stage where he was standing was actually a baptismal pool. The pool was designed like a large, waist-deep hot tub built directly into the stage floor, filled with warm, clear water. Kyle had stepped into this water to prepare for the baptism, and he was standing there waist-deep, waiting for the young woman to join him. What no one realized was that the electrical water heaters designed to keep the pool warm had suffered severe internal damage. As a result of this damage, a massive amount of live electrical current was leaking directly into the water. Because the pool was made of insulated materials, the water held the high-voltage electrical charge, but the electricity had no path to the ground. Kyle was floating in this highly charged water, completely unaware of the danger because he was not grounded. But the moment his lapel microphone failed and he reached out his hand to grab the metal microphone on the stand, everything changed in an instant. The metal microphone stand was plugged into the building's electrical system, which was connected directly to the earth. The moment Kyle's hand wrapped around that metal stand, he created a physical bridge. He became the pathway for the electricity to ground itself. The high-voltage current shot up from the water, through Kyle's legs, through his chest, and out of his hand into the microphone stand. The instant he touched it, Kyle began to scream at the top of his lungs. At first, no one in the congregation took his screams seriously. Because Kyle was so famous for his practical jokes and his playful nature, the 800 people in the sanctuary assumed this was just another joke. They thought he was pretending to be shocked or putting on a dramatic performance to make them laugh. Many people in the audience actually started to smile and chuckle, waiting for the punchline. But then, the the screams did not stop. They grew louder, more frantic, and agonizing. At this point, his screams began to include words, and the congregation heard Kyle screaming, "Help! Help me!" At that moment, the laughter died instantly. The realization swept through the room that this was not a prank. Something was horribly wrong, even though they could not see any visible danger. The church erupted into absolute chaos. Some people bowed their heads and began praying as hard as they could for their pastor's safety. Others panicked and ran out of the building, while several people pulled out their phones and frantically called 911. Paramedics rushed to the scene and transported Kyle to the hospital, but despite the desperate efforts of the first responders and the medical staff, Kyle Lake did not survive. He had been electrocuted to death in front of his own family and his entire congregation. His wife, who had watched the entire tragedy unfold from the front row, was left devastated. She later filed a lawsuit against the electrical company that had installed and maintained the heaters in the baptismal pool. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount of money, but the tragedy left a permanent scar on the community, a haunting reminder of how a joyous celebration could turn into a nightmare in a single fraction of a second. Our second story takes us far away from the state of Texas, up north to the beautiful, quiet countryside of rural Ontario, Canada. The date was Sunday, the 15th of August, 1971, and the time was right around 50 inches the afternoon. Inside a modest home, a 3-year-old man named Michael was sitting in his living room, enjoying a quiet evening. Michael was a young man who lived for excitement and adventure. He was the kind of person who could never stay inside for long, always looking for his next physical challenge. As he sat on his couch, he was flipping through a thick photo album, looking at pictures of his many outdoor exploits. There were photos of him mountain biking down incredibly steep, rocky trails, climbing up sheer cliff faces, and his absolute favorite activity, scuba diving. Michael was not just a casual hobbyist when it came to diving. He was highly trained, exceptionally skilled, and widely regarded as the most experienced diver in his entire local area. He knew the equipment inside and outside, and he understood the rules of water safety better than anyone. As he was looking through his photos, Michael was suddenly interrupted by a loud, rapid knocking on his front door. He closed the album, stood up, and went to open the door, wondering who could be visiting him at this hour. When he opened it, he found himself looking at a local police officer who appeared to be completely frantic. The officer was breathing heavily and speaking so fast that Michael could barely understand him. The officer explained that a young man had been swimming in a nearby lake earlier that afternoon, and he had suddenly vanished under the surface. He had been missing for over an hour, and there was no sign of him. The local authorities and park rangers had rushed to the scene, but they quickly realized they had a major problem. They did not have any scuba diving equipment, and none of them had the training required to conduct a deep-water search. The police had been desperately asking around the area, trying to find anyone who owned scuba gear and might be able to help. Every single person they asked had given them the same name, Michael. The officer begged Michael to lend them his scuba equipment so that the police could go into the lake and look for the missing swimmer. But the problem was, Michael was kind of caught off guard by all this, and he realized that simply giving them his equipment was a terrible idea. Scuba gear is highly complex, and without proper training, an inexperienced person trying to use it in a high-stress search could easily suffer a fatal accident. Michael knew that if he just handed over his gear, he might be setting the officers up for disaster. So, Michael looked at the officer and made a decision. He said that he would not give them his equipment, but instead he would come with them. He would put the gear on himself and conduct the search, because he had the training and experience to do it safely and efficiently. The officer was incredibly relieved and thanked him profusely. Michael quickly gathered his heavy tanks, his regulator, his mask, his fins, and his wetsuit. He threw the heavy gear into the back of the police cruiser, climbed into the passenger seat, and the two of them sped off toward the lake, with their sirens screaming through the quiet rural roads. About 30 minutes later, the police cruiser pulled into a dirt parking lot surrounded by thick, towering trees. Through the branches, Michael could see the large, deep lake resting down below. To the left side of the lake, there was a massive concrete dam that controlled the water flow, and beyond that dam, on the other side, was a fast-moving river. Michael leaped out of the car, grabbed his heavy gear, and ran down the wooded path toward the water with the officer. When they reached the shoreline, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. There was a crowd of police officers, park employees, and tourists who had been visiting the lake that day, all standing along the edge of the water. Off to the side, Michael saw the family of the missing swimmer. They were holding on to each other, crying and praying, desperate for any news. But as Michael scanned the scene, he noticed that no actual search was underway. Everyone was just standing on the bank, staring helplessly at the massive body of water. When Michael showed up with his professional diving gear, a wave of hope seemed to pass through the crowd. People looked at him as if he were a savior, believing that if anyone could find the missing young man and bring him back alive, it was Michael. Michael felt the weight of their expectations, but he knew that a person who had been underwater for over an hour had a very low chance of survival. Still, he wanted to do everything in his power to help. He sat down on the rocky shore and began the careful process of putting on his gear. The crowd watched in complete silence, their eyes locked on his movements. Once he was fully suited up, Michael stood up and looked out over the expansive lake. He needed to find a starting point for his search, but the lake was huge, and he was only one man. He stood there, scanning the surface of the water, which was completely flat and calm, like a sheet of clean glass. Because everyone had been ordered out of the water, there was not a single wave. But as Michael carefully studied the water, he noticed a tiny, subtle ripple right in the middle of the lake. It was the only movement on the entire surface. Michael pointed the ripple out to the police officer standing next to him and told him that he would start his search right there, as it seemed like the most logical place. He walked into the cool water, wading out until it reached his waist. He adjusted his mask, placed the regulator in his mouth, took a deep breath, and dove beneath the surface, disappearing into the dark water. About 15 minutes passed. On the shore, the police officer, the family, and the other searchers stood in silence, waiting for Michael to surface and give them an update. They knew he had plenty of air in his tanks to conduct a thorough search, so they tried to remain patient, but the tension was almost unbearable. Suddenly, a volunteer searcher came running along the shoreline from the direction of the dam. He was running as fast as he could, waving his arms and shouting for the police officer. He reached the officer and gasped for breath, telling him that they had found something in the river on the other side of the dam. At this point, the police officer is thinking that the missing swimmer's body had somehow carried over the dam and ended up in the river. He took off running with the volunteer, heading toward the concrete structure and pushing through the trees to the riverbank. When he arrived, he saw a group of park employees and other officers gathered in a tight circle near the water's edge. He pushed his way through the crowd, expecting to see the body of the young swimmer. But when the crowd parted and he looked down, he froze in absolute horror. Lying on the rocky ground was not the missing swimmer. It was Michael. Michael was dead. His heavy scuba tanks, his mask, and his regulator were completely gone, and his body was covered in deep, painful-looking cuts and bruises. The police officer was completely stunned, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. Michael had just entered the lake 15 minutes ago on the opposite side of the dam. How could he possibly be lying dead on the bank of the river? It took hours of investigation to piece together the tragic and terrifying sequence of events that had occurred. It turns out that 2 hours before Michael had even arrived at the lake, when the first wave of panic hit after the swimmer disappeared, a well-meaning park employee had made a catastrophic decision. The employee wanted to help find the missing swimmer as quickly as possible. He believed that if he could drain some of the water out of the lake, the water level would drop, making it much easier for searchers to see the bottom and find the young man. Without consulting any of the senior officials or thinking about the physical forces involved, the employee ran into the control room of the dam and turned a massive manual valve. This valve opened a heavy steel pipe that ran from the bottom of the lake straight through the concrete dam and emptied out into the river on the other side. The pipe was 2 feet in diameter and 30 feet long. When the valve was opened, the immense weight and pressure of the lake water created a terrifying silent vacuum. Thousands of gallons of water were being sucked into the pipe every single second, creating a massive invisible undercurrent at the bottom of the lake. The small, subtle ripple that Michael had spotted on the surface of the lake was not a sign of the missing swimmer. It was the surface expression of this deadly, human-made whirlpool. When Michael dove into the water and swam directly toward that ripple, he had no idea he was swimming straight into a lethal trap. As soon as he got close, the powerful, violent current grabbed him. The force of the suction was so extreme that it instantly ripped his oxygen tanks, mask, and fins right off his body, leaving him completely helpless. Before he could even try to swim away, Michael was sucked headfirst into the dark, narrow steel pipe. He became tightly wedged inside the 30-foot-long tube, unable to move or breathe, and he drowned inside the darkness of the dam. The sheer force of the rushing water eventually pushed his body all the way through the pipe, expelling him out of the other side and onto the bank of the river, where the searchers found him. 4 hours after Michael's body was recovered, searchers finally located the missing swimmer. His body was found lying on the shallow shore of the lake, only 150 yards away from where Michael had first entered the water. The young man had drowned long before Michael ever arrived. In the wake of this double tragedy, the lake was permanently drained, serving as a silent, empty monument to a brave young diver who lost his life to an invisible, man-made vortex. Our third and final story takes us to the town of Auburn, Indiana, inside a busy manufacturing plant on a cool summer morning. The date was the 28th of June, 1988, and the time was exactly 5:00 inches the morning. Inside the factory, the heavy machinery was already humming, and the air was filled with the smell of metal and chemicals. Standing in the quiet supply room of the facility was a 25-year-old man named Jeffrey Link. Jeffrey was a machine operator at a company called the Bastion Plating Company. This factory was specialized in a very specific industrial process. They made chrome-plated parts for automobiles. It was a demanding, high-stakes manufacturing environment where workers had to deal with intense heat, massive hydraulic machines, and highly toxic chemicals on a daily basis. Because of the nature of the work, the job was undeniably dangerous. It was not uncommon for Jeffrey and his fellow operators to go home at the end of a long shift with minor burns on their arms or legs from accidentally touching the hot machinery. But despite the physical dangers, Jeffrey loved his job. The factory was a relatively small operation, employing only about 36 people. Because they all worked together under such difficult and intense conditions, the employees had formed an incredibly tight-knit bond. They were much more than just coworkers. They were like a family. They supported each other through the long, exhausting shifts, and there was a deep sense of trust and camaraderie on the factory floor. On this particular morning, Jeffrey was tasked with performing a routine maintenance chore on one of the factory's largest pieces of equipment. This machine was a massive, enclosed metal tank that was used in the plating process. It was a confined space designed to hold large quantities of chemicals, and it was large enough for a person to climb completely inside to clean the interior walls. The tank had recently been used to store a highly toxic chemical compound known as zinc cyanide. Over time, a thick residue of this chemical would build up on the inside of the tank, and it was Jeffrey's job to go inside and clean it off so the machine could keep running efficiently. To do this, Jeffrey needed to use a chemical cleaning solution. He walked into the dark supply room, reached up to a high shelf, and grabbed a heavy plastic container of liquid. With the container in his hand, he turned and walked back out onto the raised metal walkway that ran along the main factory floor. As he walked toward the massive tank, he passed several of his coworkers, waving and exchanging friendly greetings. To Jeffrey and everyone else in the building, this was just another normal, routine morning. When he reached the opening of the massive metal tank, Jeffrey climbed through the small hatch and stepped completely inside the confined space, bringing the container of cleaning solution with him. Only a few seconds later, a coworker who was standing on the raised walkway just a short distance away heard a sudden, heavy thud coming from inside the tank. The sound was loud enough to cut through the noise of the factory machinery. The coworker stopped what he was doing and walked over to the opening of the tank to see what had happened. When he peered through the narrow hatch, he was shocked to see Jeffrey lying completely motionless on the metal floor of the tank. The coworker's first thought was that Jeffrey must have slipped on the wet metal and knocked himself unconscious. He turned to call for help, and at that exact moment, another coworker saw Jeffrey lying on the floor and immediately reacted. This second worker ran to the hatch and climbed inside the tank to pull Jeffrey out to safety. But the moment his feet touched the floor of the tank, the second worker suddenly collapsed, falling directly next to Jeffrey without making a sound. The coworker on the walkway watched in absolute disbelief. It made no sense. Two men were now lying unconscious inside the tank. And then, two more factory workers came running over, desperate to save their friends. They ignored the danger and climbed through the hatch into the tank. Within seconds, both of those men also collapsed, piling on top of the others. All four men were now completely unresponsive on the floor of the metal chamber. The coworker on the walkway finally realized that whatever was happening inside that tank was deadly, and that going inside was a fatal mistake. He spun around, sprinted off the walkway, and ran out of the building to find a phone to call 911. When he ran back into the factory just a few moments later to see what was happening, the invisible hazard that had knocked out the men inside the tank was no longer confined to that space. It had begun to spill out of the open hatch and spread across the factory floor. About 20 other employees who had gathered near the machine were now stumbling around in a state of complete panic. They were clutching their chests, gasping for breath, and vomiting violently. Some of them were losing their balance and falling onto the concrete floor, completely disoriented and unable to stand. When the first responders arrived at the factory, they rushed inside to help the stricken workers, but they too were immediately overwhelmed. As soon as the paramedics and firefighters entered the area, they became severely nauseated and disoriented, with several of them collapsing on the floor alongside the factory workers. It was as if a silent, invisible poison had taken over the entire facility, striking down anyone who came near. It was only later, after authorities equipped with heavy protective suits and self-contained oxygen tanks were able to safely enter the factory, that they were finally able to investigate the cause of the disaster. They carefully examined the inside of the tank and the plastic container that Jeffrey had brought in with him. When they analyzed these items, they discovered the tragic and simple mistake that had caused the catastrophe. But the problem was, Jeffrey had made a small, fatal mistake in the supply room. It turns out that the factory stored two different types of chemical cleaning solutions in the supply room, and both of them were kept in very similar plastic containers. Jeffrey had accidentally grabbed the wrong container from the shelf. Instead of grabbing the safe neutralizer, he had grabbed a highly acidic cleaning solution. When Jeffrey stepped inside the enclosed metal tank and poured the acidic solution onto the walls, the liquid came into direct contact with the residue of the zinc cyanide. The chemical reaction between the acid and the cyanide was instantaneous and incredibly violent. It immediately produced a dense, highly concentrated cloud of poisonous hydrogen cyanide gas. This gas is an incredibly potent chemical weapon that works by preventing the cells in the human body from using oxygen, essentially causing a person to suffocate from the inside out. Because the tank was a tightly enclosed space, the gas reached lethal levels in a fraction of a second. The moment Jeffrey took his first breath inside the tank, he was instantly knocked unconscious. When his brave coworkers rushed inside to save him, they had no idea they were walking directly into a highly concentrated gas chamber. They breathed in the poison and collapsed instantly. The gas then began to billow out of the open hatch, spreading across the factory floor and poisoning everyone in the building, including the emergency personnel who arrived to help. In total, 39 people, including factory workers and first responders, had to be rushed to the hospital to be treated for severe chemical poisoning. Tragically, 5 people died that morning. Jeffrey Link, the 3 courageous co-workers who had rushed into the tank in a desperate attempt to save his life, and 1 additional factory worker who was overwhelmed by the gas on the factory floor. The tragedy at the Bastion Plating Company stands as a haunting reminder of how a single, simple mistake in a hazardous environment can trigger a chain reaction of devastating loss, leaving an entire community to mourn the brave men who sacrificed their lives trying to save one of their own. These three tragic stories serve as a warning about the fragility of life, showing that dangerous traps can exist in the places we trust the most. We must cherish every moment, for tomorrow is never promised. If you're ready for stranger, darker, and more mysterious stories, there's a complete playlist waiting for you right now. See you in the next story. Kayla was living the life that so many people dream of having in the year 2010, and it was a year when she felt very fulfilled. She had reached the senior year of her studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, a school that is well known for its breathtaking campus that is located right on the Pacific Ocean, and of course, its well-known party scene. She had reached this point in her education. In addition to being brilliant and self-motivated, Kayla was majoring in communications, and she had her entire future planned out. She was also very well organized. But in addition to that, she was also able to take pleasure in herself. Not only did she have a tight-knit group of friends who were also her roommates, but the small rental house that she lived with two wonderful housemates was situated just a few blocks away from the campus. Despite the fact that it was a little worn around the edges, it was full with laughter and debates about studies late into the night. It was the kind of atmosphere that you see in movies. On a particular Friday evening, the atmosphere was brimming with the normal excitement that is connected with the conclusion of the week. Kayla and her friends managed to find themselves at a large party that was held not too far from their home. The party was situated just a short distance away. The music was playing at a very loud volume, and the house was absolutely packed with people. Everyone was in a particularly happy mood. Although Kayla was having a lovely time, laughing and catching up with friends, she began to get an overpowering feeling of exhaustion as the night proceeded. This was despite the fact that she was having a wonderful time. During the previous week, she had been attending lectures and studying for exams, and the only thing that she could think about was getting into her own bed. I had a difficult week ahead of me. The next thing she did was turn to her friends and query as to whether or not anyone else was ready to depart for the evening. On the other hand, they were all still bursting with vigor and did not want the celebration to finish, even though it was getting close to its conclusion. The reason that Kayla notified them that she was going to go home by herself from work was because she did not want to give the impression that she was a pessimist. It was not a serious cause for anxiety, this. It was literally only a 5-minute walk away from her house, and it was a straight shot along a street that was well lit and familiar. The distance was only 5 minutes. It had been 100 times before that she had walked it, both during the day and at night. After saying her goodbyes, she silently left the house through the front door and started the short journey back home, taking delight in the energizing night air as she traveled. Sarah and Jessica, who were her roommates, had come to the conclusion that they would prefer to spend the evening in a tranquil setting when they returned to their residence. It was determined that they would enjoy a more relaxed evening because they were also seniors and were under the weight of the responsibilities that came with their academic obligations. They had invited a couple of their friends over, but they were just hanging out in the living room, drinking a bottle of wine and chatting with their friends. Despite the fact that they had invited over a couple of their friends, what they encountered was a Friday evening that was uneventful and characterized by harmony. Kayla went through the motions of looking for her keys when she had gotten at her front door, and then she opened the door for herself. She had imagined that the house would be a quiet place, and she was right. After some consideration, she came to the conclusion that her roommates and their friends were probably already in their own bedrooms at this moment. Following her entrance into the building and the subsequent closing of the door behind her, she tilted her head to the right and cast a gaze in that direction. There was a large sofa that was pushed up against the main wall of their living room, which was somewhat smaller than the rest of the space. In addition to it, there was a guy occupant resting on the sofa. It was a blanket that was pulled all the way up to his chin, and he was lying down with his head tucked under it. he was relaxing. When he looked at her, his eyes were wide open and he was staring at her in a direct manner. During this brief pause, Kayla made a brief stop. It was as if she had no awareness whatsoever of his existence. The discovery of a stranger sleeping on the couch in a college residence, particularly on a Friday night, was not completely out of the ordinary. On the other hand, it was not completely out of the ordinary neither. At that moment, she immediately made the assumption that he must be a friend of Sarah or Jessica's friends, someone who had probably had a small amount of alcohol and was currently sleeping off the affects of their drinking. She gave him a small nod that was polite but obviously fatigued, and then she started walking across the room in the direction of the corridor that led to her bedroom. She was exhausted but polite. On the other hand, she felt an odd sensation in the nape of her neck as she walked. This occurred while she was walking. It didn't feel quite right, especially for me. As she casually looked back over her shoulder, she noticed the man who was seated on the couch. He drew her attention during this moment. Within that fraction of a second, he exerted some kind of movement. In addition to removing his head from the cushion, he had also changed the blanket so that it was little lower than it had been previously. It was no longer enough for him to merely look at her. Rather, he was observing her with a level of intensity that appeared to be improperly written. A terrible and gloomy image was shown to her, and it prompted the hair on her arms to stand up in response to the moment. At that same moment, each and every alarm bell that she had been playing in her thoughts began to ring. On the face of that partygoer, there was no indication of how exhausted they were. On the other hand, that was an entirely different problem. Fear was a powerful and fundamental emotion that she experienced, and it engulfed her completely. Her speed intensified, and rather than walking in a casual manner, she was hurriedly making her way to her room. She wanted to get there as quickly as possible. It was the final time that she appeared to turn around. When she was finally able to reach the entrance to her bedroom, she hurriedly went inside and then firmly shut the door behind her. Following that, she engaged in an activity that she had almost never considered doing before. She bent down and turned the knob on her doorknob until she heard the lock click into place. While she was doing this, she waited for the lock to click into place. She could count on one hand the number of times she had closed the door to her bedroom during the 2 years that she had lived in that house when she had been there. She had been there for as long as she could remember. To put it another way, there was never a precondition for it to exist. Tonight, on the other hand, she had a hammering sensation in her stomach that indicated she ought to have that barrier. A few minutes later, the exhilaration that she had felt as a result of the strange encounter started to gradually go away, and the exhaustion that she had been experiencing during the week started to take control of her actions. She went into a deep sleep in a few minutes after falling asleep. A weird sound awoke Kayla from her deep sleep 2 hours later. She had been sleeping for a long time. For a considerable amount of time, she had been asleep. A soft tapping sound could be heard, but it was persistent throughout the entire process. During the beginning of the time period, she was completely and utterly confused. The combination of the sleep she had obtained and the couple of beers she had consumed earlier had both contributed to the cloudiness of her mind. Her space was utterly devoid of light. As she sat up in her bed, she made an effort to identify the origin of the alarming sound. The noise was coming from the direction of the exit. If there is a limb of the tree pressing against the glass, has it been removed? And in point of fact, it was far closer than that. As her senses gradually restored to their usual state, she became conscious of what it was that she was experiencing. It appeared as though someone was tapping their fingers on the wooden door that would lead to her bedroom, and it sounded as though they were doing so. She looked at the murky silhouette of her door, which was causing her to feel a sense of perplexity. Who would be doing something like that at this hour of the night? That is the question. Perhaps it was one of her roommates who needed to question about anything that was related to her responsibilities. On the other hand, why would they tap for such a short period of time? Following that, she recalled the individual who was, at the time, seated on the couch. Suddenly, she felt a tiny acceleration in the rate at which her heart was beating. Maybe he was the one? And if that were to be the case, what exactly was it that he wanted? A momentary pause was seen in the rhythmic drumming that had been going on. The silence that followed was one that was substantial and strained, and it did not let up at any point. After that, a new sound gradually replaced the previous one in the mix. The sounds were similar to those of someone scratching them. The direction of her door was the source of a scratching sound that was barely perceptible despite its proximity. Kayla's feelings of confusion and confusion grew into frustration as time went on. Okay, it was clear that this was the individual who was seated on the couch. There is a high probability that he was under the influence of alcohol and that he thought he was being hilarious by pulling some kind of foolish joke. This motion was not something she was in the mood for, in addition to the fact that she was fatigued. During the time that she was sitting there in bed, she pondered whether or not she should simply get up, throw open the door, and tell him to stop being so unreasonable. However, the itching changed before she could convince herself to get out of bed. This occurred before she was able to get dressed. It became more upsetting and louder as time went on. The sound was no longer that of fingernails, rather it was something else as well. The texture was more grainy and it had a metallic aspect to it. The tone of the music changed from one of playfulness to one of aggression. It was no longer playful. During the time when the sound was being heard, someone was making an attempt to enter the room through the door. The negative feeling that she had previously received from him came flooding back to her, and it was increased by a factor of 3. She experienced a decrease in her annoyance, and in its place, she was filled with genuine panic. After some duration, she came to the realization that there was no way that she would ever open the door. Instead of reaching for it, she reached for her phone, which was resting on the nightstand across from her. During the moment that she was retrieving her text messages, she became aware that her hands were trembling slightly. She had texted Sarah, who was her roommate, a brief message. Sarah was the recipient of the message. She then pressed the send button and waited, her gaze fixated on the door leading to her bedroom as she listened to the scratching that continued. "Hey, could you please come out here? Your friend is acting really strange and trying to get into my room. It had taken just a moment. Now there are 2 of them." However, there was no response. It continued to scratch, and the sound that it made was one that was both persistent and threatening. So, it's plausible that Sarah was a heavy sleeper. All right, let's investigate. Jessica, the other roommate, was the recipient of a new text message from Kayla, and she had the opportunity to read it. The message that she typed out was, for the most part, virtually identical. She waited once more after sending the text message that she had sent. "He was outside my door, scratching at it and freaking me out. Jessica, please come out to the living room and get your friend. He's outside my door, scratching at it and freaking me out." The scratching continued, and it was a sound that was both persistent and unnerving. This was the case even if the residence was normally silent. The other side of the coin is that there was no answer. Despite the fact that she continued to consume food, she was beginning to get a terrible feeling of worry in her stomach. What reasons did they not react to your question? This marked the end of the scratching that had been going on. Kayla was anxiously anticipating that he had finally given up and vanished, so she held her breath for a brief length of time. She was holding her breath. However, the silence was broken by a new sound that was even more terrifying than the one that had been there before. A metallic clink and rattle was made as a result of her doorknob being jiggled, which was the sound that was heard. His intention was to inspect the lock, thus he was making a concerted effort to turn the handle. By this point, Kayla had reached an extreme level of annoyance and had developed a profound worry. Certainly, this was not a joke at all. Someone who is intoxicated would not do something like this. Someone was attempting to enter her room by using force against her in order to successfully do so. She was able to gather her calm and yelled out, "Hey! Stop it! Get away from my door!" She made an effort to convey an angry and authoritative tone in the hopes of diverting his attention away from her. Her voice, on the other hand, was shaking visibly with fear. Despite this, the jiggling persisted ceaselessly. It was almost as if he had not even noticed that she was a part of the room. She was well aware that by this point, texting was not going to be an effective method of communication. Her calling them and rousing them up was something that was required of her. It was then that they would enter the room and deal with the person in question. "Sarah," she stated as she phoned Sarah's number. After the phone had rung once or twice, Sarah finally picked it up, and by the time she did, her voice was dripping with the weight of sleep. "Hello?" It was a loud and unpleasant muttering that Kayla used when she spoke. "Sarah, you need to get up right now. Come out into the living room and tell your friend to knock it off. He's trying to get into my room and he's totally harassing me." A little lull occurred in the conversation that was taking place on the other end of the line. It was clear to me that Sarah was still attempting to make sense of what Kayla was saying, since she appeared to be perplexed by what she was hearing. "Kayla, what are you talking about?" "What friend?" "The guy!" Kayla yelled out as her fury and dread began to intensify before her eyes. "The guy you had over. The one sleeping on our couch." Sarah's dreamy perplexity was abruptly replaced with a tone that resonated with a chilling clarity and concern. Instantaneously, Sarah's confusion had disappeared without a trace. "Kayla, we didn't have anyone over. Our friends left hours ago. There isn't anyone on the couch. If there is somebody out there, you need to call the police. Right now." The words were like a blow to the gut for Kayla, and she could feel them hitting her. Suddenly, her bodily fluids turned ice. The individual who was sitting on the couch was not a friend of the person sitting there. His identity was unknown to anyone. As soon as she got at her house, she discovered that an unknown person had been there at their residence. At this very moment, she was being confronted by an individual whom she did not know, who was attempting to smash down the door that led to her bedroom. She experienced a surge of pure adrenaline coursing through her body like a torrent. Her mental state turned into one of surviving the situation. The command that she gave to her roommate was very clear, and she delivered it in a voice that was eerily calm. "Sarah, lock your door. Lock it immediately." Both the jiggling of her doorknob and the violent scratching came to a complete halt at that same moment, as if the intruder had been paying attention to what was going on. The home was silent for the third time in a row. Kayla strained her ears attentively in response to the question of whether or not there was any sign of where he had gone. If he was on the phone with her, was he able to hear her? He just gave up, didn't he? During the few dreadful seconds that passed, there was absolutely nothing about it. The silence that had been there up until that point was then broken by a crash that was exceedingly loud and originated from the opposite end of the house. There was one more one that followed it, and then there was another one that followed it. It was the sound of a body being thrown into a door that was heard by those who were present. Moving on from her room, he was now making an effort to compel his way into the bedroom that was occupied by her two roommates. He was no longer in her room at that point. At that moment, Kayla became aware of cries emanating from the room of her roommates, and she immediately began to scream herself. The sounds of complete and utter fear could be heard throughout the entirety of the house. During the time when Kayla was experiencing a state of fear, she was able to, in some way, call 911. At the same time, she was frantically attempting to convey to the operator what was going on, which was that there was a man in their house who was attempting to enter their rooms. After she had finished explaining the situation, she was able to hear the sound of wood splintering coming from the direction of the corridor. The sound of the hammering, which was accompanied by her own panicked breathing, was not the only noise that she heard. She also heard another sounds. The distinct sound of their sliding glass door in the back of the house being jerked open and then shut again and again until being shut again at the end of the process. It was at that moment that she became aware of the majestic and penetrating sound of sirens, which initially started off as a faint sound, but gradually became more and more audible. The law enforcement officers were present. At the same time that blue and red lights flashed through the window through which she was sleeping, the walls of her bedroom were painted with a flurry of colors being applied in a hectic manner. Kayla was able to pick up on the demands that were being yelled out by the officers who were stationed outside. She heard the loud thud of their own front door being forced open, followed by the sound of boots on their wooden floors and the sound of police officers yelling, "Police!" clear, as they made their way through the house, room by room. She yelled out, "Santa Barbara Police Department, have you come out and show yourself?" After what seemed like an endless length of time had passed, she was startled to hear a loud knock on the door of her bedroom. The shaking in Kayla's hands was so extreme that she was unable to turn the latch on the door as she ran to the entrance. She yelled as she hurried to the door, "This is the police!" "Is anyone in there?" as she entered the building. When she opened it, she was instantly faced by two law enforcement officers who had their weapons drawn and immediately lowered them when they saw her. They had been waiting for her to open it. She was led into the living room where her two roommates, Sarah and Jessica, were already there, wrapped in blankets, and appeared pale and terrified. After a short period of time, they investigated her room and then led her into the main room. Both the yard and the exterior of the house were thoroughly searched by the officers who finished their investigation. After leaving the premises, the trespasser had left. He had vanished into the shadows in the same amount of time that he had appeared in the first place. As soon as the authorities had made certain that the location was secure, they began fitting together the pieces of what had just taken place. The very first thing that they did was to take the girls outside to the side of the house in the direction of a door that they did not use very frequently. The flashlight carried by a law enforcement officer was pointed in the direction of the doorknob. The response that he gave was, "It appears that this is how he got in." Kayla, along with her roommates, leaned in to acquire a better glimpse at the situation. After using the beam of the flashlight to highlight the doorknob and the latch plate, it was observed that there were a lot of deep scratches and pry marks all around the doorknob and over the latch plate. This piece of wood had been fractured and gouged in several places. A law enforcement officer stated that it seemed as though someone had used a tool, either a knife or a screwdriver, to force their way inside the facility by jimmying the lock. This was indicated by the officer's statement. There wasn't just a drunk person who happened to walk into the wrong house by accident. It was more than that. Here was an attempt to break and enter. An attempt to break into the residence. It was a boring and chilly experience as the truth of the scenario began to soak in, and it was all because of the situation. Following their return to the building, the authorities asked Kayla to recount her story to them, beginning with the moment she arrived at her residence. The unnerving vision of the man sitting on the couch, her decision to shut the door, and the horrifying sounds that followed were all repeated by her as she led them down the corridor to her bedroom. She also described to them the awful sounds that followed. One of the officers flashed his flashlight on the door itself as she stood in front of her closed bedroom door, displaying how he had been scratching and jiggling the knob. She was demonstrating how he had been doing everything. During the time that she was standing there, she provided the demonstration. Every single one of them was present at that very time. To her surprise, it was a great deal more upsetting than she had anticipated. Scratches and gouges of a severe kind were done in a furious manner, and they covered the entire region that was surrounding her doorknob. In other places, the wood had been torn, and the metal of the doorknob itself had been scratched and dented throughout its surface. There were also some locations where the wood had been shredded. He had been making a concerted effort to force the lock open, to do damage to it, and to attain access to her. On closer inspection, it became clear that he had not merely been jiggling the handle, rather, he had been engaging in all of these activities. It was very alarming to see the amount of force that he had been putting to a tool. During the process of the police officer directing the beam of his flashlight downward towards the ground, the light caught something that was made of metal. This situation arose as a result of the officer moving the beam. It was there, on the ground just in front of her door, that she found a set of scissors and a little kitchen knife that was quite sharp. That they were not coming from their kitchen was not the case. Nobody had ever seen them before. Nobody had ever seen them before. Within the corridor, the mood became more tense, and still, as time went on, the tools that were sitting on the ground were the primary center of everyone's attention at that moment. Both the tools that he had used to break into their home and the tools that he had taken to her bedroom door after he had broken into their home are included in this collection. The officers exchanged a somber glance with one another as they looked at each other. One of them got down on their knees and studied the knife and scissors without touching them. This allowed them to examine them without touching them. Following that, he got to his feet and directed his attention to Kayla in a forthright manner. His words created a horrifying picture of what they believed had taken place, and he then proceeded to reenact what they believed had taken place. He went on to explain that the burglar most likely used that knife and those scissors to forcefully open the side door. He said that this was the most likely explanation for the burglar's actions. On a Friday night in a college town, it is quite probable that he was a burglar who anticipated that the residence would be vacant. This is a very plausible scenario. Following his successful infiltration into the building, he began searching for anything that might be swiftly taken, such as laptops, cash, or wallets. It is probable that he was in the middle of inspecting the living room when he was caught off guard by the sound of the front door opening. He was completely taken aback by the sound of the door opening. The fact that Kayla had arrived was the reason why his plan was unsuccessful. It was only a few seconds before he responded to my question. As soon as he noticed the couch leaning against the wall, he snatched the blanket that was draped over it and threw himself down with the intention of drawing the cover up to his chin. This was his final attempt to disseminate information about himself. His anticipation was that she would simply walk by and that she would not even notice him in the dim light. He was expecting her to overlook him. An abrupt and hurried decision was made at that precise moment. Nevertheless, Kayla did take note of him. However, what is much more disturbing is the fact that she stared him in the eye. An explanation of the dramatic shift that had taken place was supplied by the officer during that brief span of time. When you saw his face, the officer said in a tone that was low and serious, you were no longer just an obstacle in a burglary. You became a witness, and there is a good chance that this made you his primary target. The officer's tone was low and serious. They are under the impression that he remained in the living room for a few minutes after she entered her room, and then he left the room. It is highly probable that he was actively considering the best way to proceed with the situation. Regardless of whether or not he made an effort to sneak out via the back door, he was aware that she had detected him. Those individuals were able to identify him. His impression of her was that she was a loose end that needed to be handled and given attention. Consequently, he arrived to a conclusion. He had no intention of abandoning a witness he had brought with him. When he had finished gathering the tools that he had used to enter the house, which included the knife and the scissors, he then proceeded to stroll down the hallway until he reached her door. There is a high probability that he made an initial effort to unlock the door by tapping the handle instead. Immediately, as he became aware that it was locked, he began making fruitless attempts to open it by utilizing the instruments that were available to him. A plausible explanation for the tapping that she initially heard was that he was trying to find a vulnerable area in order to remain silent. This was one of the probable explanations. The more frustrated he became, however, the more aggressive he became, scraping and gouging at the lock in an attempt to break out of the situation where he was trapped. He had a strong desire to set foot inside the structure. It is believed by the police that the phone contact was the most important aspect that ultimately prevented her death. During the time that Kayla was in contact with the intruder, she would have been able to listen in on her conversation with her roommate over the phone. That she was awake and chatting on the phone, most likely with the authorities, was the first thing that he would have known. There were two other things that he would have realized, additionally to the fact that she was not the only person there in the apartment at the time of the incident. It was the presence of her roommates, who were now awake and conscious, that prompted him to make a full and utter change in his plan. His attempt to knock on Kayla's door was unsuccessful, and he hurried to the room where her roommates were staying in a state of dread. At that moment, he gave up. The loud hammering was executed as a deliberate, frantic, and disorderly move that was the final move. Perhaps he was trying to get to them in order to silence everyone, or perhaps he was simply trying to create a distraction for himself. Either way, he was possibly trying to get to them. At that very moment, however, he must have been cognizant of the sirens that were quickly approaching. He was conscious of the fact that his remaining time had run out. In a hurry, he made his way to the rear of the home, where he forced open the sliding glass door. After that, he disappeared into the complex network of dark streets and backyards that encircled the house. In addition to collecting the knife and scissors as evidence, the police department also dusted for fingerprints, recorded statements, and collected the knife. They examined the entire neighborhood, but nobody had reported seeing or hearing anything that was out of the norm until they were finished. The man was, in fact, a ghost after all. The absence of any evidence of his identification, such as his name, fingerprints, or any other identifying qualities, is a very concerning situation. What had transpired was that he had merely been present in their home, a terrifying presence, and then he had disappeared without a trace. Kayla, along with the other individuals that shared her room, experienced a huge influence as a result of the events of that night. The residence in question would not be suitable for them to live in. Every creak of the floorboards and every shadow that appeared in the corner of a room included a memory of the man who was sitting on the couch. This memory was present in every single one of these things. The plain feeling of being safe in their own home had been shattered in a matter of minutes, and it had been taken away from them. Instead, it had been taken away from them. Several days after they had violated the terms of the lease agreement, they moved out of the apartment. What ifs were a constant source of anxiety for Kayla for a considerable amount of time. Let us imagine for a second that she had stayed at the party for 10 minutes longer than she had originally planned. Imagine for a moment that she hadn't been so worn out. What would have happened? Her thoughts kept coming back to the most terrifying question of all, which was the one that the police had asked her earlier that evening. What would have happened if she hadn't obeyed that sudden, incomprehensible instinct to lock the door to her bedroom? Her mind kept going back to the question. It seems likely that a simple, almost unthinking action, such as the little click of a lock, was what ultimately saved her life. It was a straightforward activity that just about appeared to be mindless. Whoever it was that sat on her couch and attempted to break down her door while brandishing a knife in his hand was never identified. The individual who attempted to do so was never identified. On the other hand, he was never picked up. The only thing that she knew for certain was that he was still out there, a faceless creature that had vanished back into the darkness. This was the only thing she knew for certain. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting. Till the next time we meet again. What's going on? In February of 1999, 3 women set out on what was supposed to be a fun road trip through California. They planned to visit Yosemite National Park, spend time together, and continue on to Arizona for a family vacation. But before the trip was over, all three of them would vanish. And months later, investigators would uncover one of the most horrifying murder cases in Yosemite's history, a case involving a serial killer who had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. On the 12th of February, 1999, a 42-year-old woman named Carol Sund, along with her 15-year-old daughter Julie and Julie's longtime friend, 16-year-old Silvina Palazzo, boarded a plane in their hometown of Eureka, California. They were all excited for the trip ahead. After a quick one-hour flight, their plane touched down in San Francisco. They made their way through the bustling airport, collected their bags from baggage claim, and then walked over to the airport's car rental center. At the counter, Carol handled all the paperwork. She signed the rental agreement, showed her license, and was handed a set of car keys. The three of them then headed out into the sprawling parking lot, where they located their rental car, a shiny red 1999 Pontiac Grand Prix sedan. After loading their luggage into the trunk, they climbed inside. Carol got behind the wheel, while Julie and Silvina settled in for the ride. Then, Carol started the engine and began driving east towards Stockton, California, and specifically the University of the Pacific. The main reason for this part of the trip was for Julie. She was a dedicated cheerleader and was scheduled to compete in a big competition the very next day held at that university. But it was more than just a competition for her. Julie was seriously considering attending that school after she graduated from high school, so this was a perfect opportunity for her and her mom to get a real feel for the campus and the surrounding area. And since Silvina was already visiting Julie at her home in Eureka, it just made sense for her to tag along for the adventure. It was a trip filled with promise and excitement for the future. After about an hour and a half on the road, the trio arrived in Stockton. They found their hotel, checked in, and got settled for the night. The next day, February 13th, was the big day for Julie. She competed in her cheerleading event, and afterwards, she, her mom, and Silvina spent the rest of the day exploring the university. They walked through the grounds, checked out the different buildings, and got a sense of what life would be like there. They explored the town of Stockton as well, just enjoying their time together. Early the next morning, on Valentine's Day, February 14th, the three women checked out of their hotel in Stockton. They got back in their red Pontiac and started a 3-hour drive southeast. Their destination was a sprawling motel complex called the Cedar Lodge, which was located just outside the western entrance of Yosemite National Park. Their plan was to spend the next couple of days sightseeing inside the magnificent park. They wanted to see the giant sequoias, the towering cliffs, and all the natural beauty Yosemite had to offer. After their Yosemite adventure, they were scheduled to drive back to the San Francisco airport. There, they were going to meet Carol's husband and Julie's father, Jen Sund. The four of them would then continue their family vacation together, flying to Arizona to explore the Grand Canyon before finally heading back home to Eureka. So, around midday on the 14th, the red Pontiac pulled into the parking lot of the Cedar Lodge. Because it was the middle of winter, the tourist season was slow and the lot was nearly empty. They parked the car and went into the front office to check in. They got their room keys and then walked from the office along a row of first-floor rooms. Their room was at the very end of the building, a corner unit, room 509. Carol used the key, opened the door, and they all went inside, dropping their luggage on the floor. After the long drive, they all felt pretty tired. They decided that they were too exhausted to try and go sightseeing in the park that day. So instead, they opted for a low-key afternoon and evening, mostly just relaxing in their hotel room, unwinding, and getting ready for their big day in the park tomorrow. The next morning, February 15th, they woke up early, full of energy. They hopped back into their red rental car and drove the short distance to the western entrance of Yosemite. They entered the park, found a place to park their car, and began their day of exploration. It was a truly wonderful day. They were in awe of the astonishing cliff sides, the snow-covered mountains, and the massive ancient sequoia trees that towered over them. They walked through beautiful meadows that seemed to stretch out forever. Towards the end of the day, as the afternoon light began to fade, Julie and Silvina even went ice skating on a frozen pond. It was a perfect, almost magical day spent together in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Finally, as the sun started to go down, casting long shadows across the valley, the trio decided to call it a day. They left the park, got back into their rental car, and drove back to the Cedar Lodge. For dinner, they ate at the lodge's own 1950s-style diner. They ordered hamburgers and talked about their incredible day. After dinner, they swung by the front desk and rented a couple of VHS movie tapes to watch back in their room. Once they were back inside room 509, the women changed into their pajamas. They all piled onto the beds and watched one of the movies they had rented. When it was over, they brushed their teeth, got into their beds, turned out the lights, and tried to go to sleep. But just a few minutes after the room went dark, they heard a knock on their door. The following day, February 16th, Jen's son was waiting anxiously at the San Francisco airport. He was there to meet his wife, Carol, his daughter, Julie, and her friend, Silvina. He kept looking at his watch, the minutes ticking by. He knew their flight to Arizona was scheduled to take off soon, and they didn't have much time to spare. He scanned the crowds, hoping to see them come running around a corner at any moment so they could all make a dash for the gate and just barely make their flight. But they didn't appear. Time kept passing, and there was still no sign of them. Finally, the final boarding call was announced. Jens, who didn't have a cell phone, and neither did Carol, had to make a decision. He began to think that there must have been some kind of miscommunication. Maybe they got their wires crossed, and Carol and the girls had taken an earlier flight and were already on their way to Arizona. It seemed like the only logical explanation. So, at the very last minute, he decided to board the flight by himself. He flew to Arizona, holding on to the hope that his family would be there waiting for him when he landed. But when his plane touched down in Arizona, his family was not there. He rushed to their hotel, his heart pounding, hoping maybe they had gone there directly. But they weren't there either. He spoke to the person at the hotel's front desk, asking if his wife Carol had contacted them or checked in. The clerk said no. They hadn't heard from her, and they had no record of her being there at all. At this point, Jens was obviously very upset and deeply worried. He spent the rest of the day on the phone, calling around to friends, family members, and anyone he could think of who might know where Carol and the girls could be. But no one had heard from them. No one knew where they were. That night, as Jens prepared to go to bed alone in his hotel room, he tried to convince himself that everything was probably fine. He told himself this was just some kind of screw-up, a mix-up in their plans. He knew Carol was an unbelievably fierce and competent woman. She would take care of the girls no matter what. He was sure he would see them or hear from them by tomorrow morning. But when he woke up the next morning, there was still no word. Carol had not made any contact with the hotel or tried to reach him in any way. There was just no sign of her or the girls. The hope he had been clinging to faded away, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. Jens finally contacted the police. That day, after the police spoke with Jens and got all the details, the very first call they made was to the Cedar Lodge. It was the last known place that Carol, Julie, and Silvina had been. The manager of the lodge told the police that he had not seen Carol or the girls on the day they were supposed to check out, which was the 16th. But, he explained, this wasn't necessarily unusual. Carol had paid in advance when she checked in, so she wouldn't have needed to stop by the front desk on her way out. So, that detail wasn't an anomaly. The manager also told the police that on the 16th, after the checkout time had passed, the cleaning staff had gone to room 509. When they went inside, the room was vacant. Nothing seemed out of place or amiss. It was relatively clean, except for some wet towels that had been left on the floor of the bathroom. The keys to the room were left on the desk, just as they were supposed to be. To the cleaners, it simply looked like the women had packed up and left that morning. So the next step for the police was to reach out to the car rental company at the San Francisco airport. They needed to know if Carol had made it back to the airport and dropped off the red Pontiac. But when they spoke to the manager of the rental company, the news wasn't good. The manager confirmed that no, Carol had not dropped off her car. And she hadn't called to ask about extending her rental agreement, which was now officially overdue. Based on the information they gathered from the lodge and from the rental car company, the police began to operate on a few working theories. The most likely scenario, they thought, was that the three women had left their motel room on the morning of the 16th and had gotten into a car accident somewhere on the winding mountain roads. Maybe their car had gone off an embankment and just hadn't been found yet. Another possibility was that they had driven somewhere, perhaps back into Yosemite National Park or to another trail, gotten out of their car to go for a walk, and had gotten lost. Or, and this was the least likely theory at the time, they had fallen victim to some kind of crime. At this early stage, the police were not seriously considering the idea that foul play was involved. A massive search was launched. Search teams scoured the roads and trails in and around the Cedar Lodge complex, as well as the areas around the western entrance to Yosemite. But they found absolutely nothing. Not a single trace of the women or their car. A number of workers from the Cedar Lodge were interviewed by police as a matter of routine, and they were all subsequently cleared of any wrongdoing. Police also spoke with a number of friends and family members of the three missing women, and they too were cleared. Then, a few days after the search began, there was a break in the case. Carol's wallet, with her ID and credit cards still inside, was found lying on the ground in Modesto, California. Modesto was a city located about 2 hours west of the Cedar Lodge. Some high school students had spotted it on the ground and turned it over to a police officer. This discovery was a game changer. There was no logical reason for Carol and the girls to have been in Modesto. It wasn't on their route back to San Francisco, nor was it near any tourist destinations they had planned to visit. This signaled to the police that a third party had to have been involved in their disappearance. And if that was the case, then it was almost certain that these three women had fallen victim to a crime. Over the next several weeks, police continued their search. They expanded their efforts, looking along all the roads and trails between the Cedar Lodge and Modesto. They searched all over the area where the wallet was found. But besides that one wallet, there were no further developments in the case. The trail went cold. Then, on March 18th, about a month after the three women had originally gone missing, a hiker was exploring a remote forest. He was about 2 hours north of the Cedar Lodge and about an hour and a half northeast of Modesto. He was way off the beaten path when he turned onto a rarely used logging road. As he was walking down this road, he saw something up ahead. It was the skeleton of a car. It looked like the vehicle had been completely destroyed by a fire. He called it in to the police. When the police arrived, they weren't sure what they were looking at first. But they were eventually able to identify the vehicle. The charred metal shell was what remained of the red rental car that Carol and the girls had been using. They began to carefully search the vehicle. Inside the main cabin of the car, there was almost nothing left. It looked like there were some remnants of suitcases and maybe some burned clothing, but for the most part, it was just the metal frame of the car and the seat springs. But when they opened the trunk, they made a grisly discovery. Inside were two very badly burned bodies. Their hands were still bound behind their backs. Using dental records, forensics was able to confirm that the bodies belonged to Carol Sund and Silvina Palazzo. But there was no sign of Carol's daughter, Julie. The 15-year-old was not in the car or anywhere in the surrounding area. This created a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Julie was still alive somewhere. Maybe if law enforcement acted fast enough, they could find her and save her before it was too late. But that hope was lost just a couple of days into the search around the car site. They still hadn't found any sign of Julie when the police received an anonymous handwritten letter. On the letter was a crude hand-drawn map. It showed a very specific spot overlooking a lake. The lake was Don Pedro Lake, which was located about an hour to the south of where the burned car was found. And on the note, along with the map, was a single, chilling phrase. It just said, "We had fun with this one." Using the crude map, police went to Don Pedro Lake. They found the overlook that was marked on the map, and from there, they looked down the steep hillside. And that's when they saw it. They found the crumpled and badly decomposed remains of Julie Sund. At this point, the police already had several suspects they had picked up in Modesto, California. They believed these individuals were connected in some way to what had happened to the three women. Of these suspects, two were of particular interest. They were half-brothers, Eugene Dykes and Michael Larwick. They had been arrested shortly after Carol's wallet had been found for shooting at a Modesto police officer, for several drug charges, and for violating their parole. Once these half-brothers were in custody, Eugene made several self-incriminating remarks. He basically insinuated that he and Michael had been involved in what happened to the three women. And then, after the bodies of Carol, Sylvina, and Julie were found, the investigation seemed to find more evidence pointing their way. Synthetic fibers that were found all over Carol's body matched synthetic fibers that were pulled from the clothing and vehicle of Michael and Eugene when they were arrested. So, the police were very confident that they had their killers, and that they already had them behind bars. But they still needed to compile more evidence before they could formally charge them with the murders and make their names public. So when the news broke about the women's bodies being found and the public began to panic about a killer or killers being on the loose, the police held a press conference. They told everyone to calm down. They said, "We have the people responsible, we just can't tell you who they are yet." They asked the public to be patient while they built their case, but they assured everyone that they were safe and there was nothing to worry about. But 4 months went by, and the police still had not come out and publicly charged anyone with these murders. They continued to insist to the public that they had their killers behind bars and that nobody had anything to worry about. On the afternoon of July 22nd, roughly 4 months after the discovery of the three bodies, a man named Dr. Desmond Kidd, who was the medical director for Yosemite, had just finished a long 2-4-hour shift at the park's clinic. He had just gotten back to his cabin, which was located inside Yosemite, when his pager went off. He went to a phone, dialed the number on his pager, and the park dispatcher picked up. The dispatcher said, "Hey, Doctor. Kidd, can you be a part of a search for a missing person? Doctor." Kidd said, "Sure, he'd love to help." Then there was a pause, and the park dispatcher said, "Hey, just so you know, there are law enforcement implications with this one." And then, before Dr. Ba, Kidd could ask what he meant, the dispatcher hung up the phone. Doctor. Kidd was really confused by that last comment. In the 3 years he had worked at the park, he had unfortunately been involved in many searches for missing people. But they were never tied to any sort of criminal activity. They were always cases of hikers getting lost or falling and injuring themselves, which was a fairly common occurrence inside a park as vast as Yosemite. So as soon as a convoy of other Yosemite staff members, who were also part of the search team, rolled up in front of his cabin, Dr. Kidd ran outside. He hopped into one of the vehicles and asked the driver, "What's going on? What are these law enforcement implications with this missing person?" The driver explained to him what was happening. He said, "Hey, you know how 4 months ago we had those 3 Yosemite tourists go missing, Carol, Julie, and Sylvina? And they were found murdered outside of the park?" He continued, "Well, even though the police have been saying they have their killers behind bars, they still haven't actually named who their killers are or charged anyone with their murders. And that's made a lot of us think that maybe they don't have the killer. Maybe there's a killer still on the loose. And unfortunately, tonight, we have another person who's gone missing inside the park. And she's gone missing under very mysterious circumstances, which has led a lot of us to think that it's possible, if there really is a killer out there, they've struck again tonight." Doctor. Kidd was totally shocked by this news. But he was even more shocked when he found out who it was that was missing. It was someone he knew. Her name was Joy Armstrong, and she was a 26-year-old naturalist employed by Yosemite. A naturalist is like an expert tour guide, someone who knows everything about the park's flora and fauna. Doctor. Kidd and the rest of the convoy sped through the park. They turned down an unmarked road with huge trees on either side. Eventually, they came out of this heavily forested road and entered into an unbelievably beautiful meadow. And on the very far end of this huge meadow, there was a single green cabin sitting at the base of a mountain with a forest on the other side of it. This totally secluded cabin in the middle of Yosemite was where Joy was living. As Dr. Kid and the convoy drove across the meadow and got closer to the cabin. He could see park rangers walking around the perimeter, marking it off with yellow police tape. When Kid's vehicle came to a stop right outside the taped-off area, they all got out. They could see a white pickup truck parked right next to the cabin. It was Joie's truck, and inside of it was a bunch of luggage. It looked like some of the luggage had spilled out onto the ground, and some of the truck's doors were still open. It gave Kid and the other searchers the impression that Joie must have been either loading things into her truck or unloading things from her truck at the exact moment she went missing. Kid and the other searchers huddled up with the park rangers. The rangers explained that Joie's friends, who lived in San Francisco, had been expecting Joie to arrive at their house the day before. But when she never showed up and they couldn't get in touch with her, they had called the park authorities to report her missing. That's why they were all there now, looking for her. After discussing the circumstances of the case, they all decided to break into 5 different search groups and begin searching the immediate area around the cabin. Kid and 4 other searchers began walking behind the cabin, towards the tree line. Once they got into the forest, they started walking towards a nearby creek. As they walked up along this creek, they suddenly noticed a whole bunch of trampled ferns and broken saplings. It looked like someone had come running through there in a panic. Perhaps the person who was running was Joie. So they began following these tracks which ran right alongside the creek. Then, at some point, one of the searchers yelled out, "Hey, what's that up there?" About 10 feet ahead of them, the ground sloped down into a ditch, out of their direct line of sight. But right before the ditch, hanging on a small tree branch near the ground, was a set of car keys glinting in the sunlight. Kid, who was at the front of his small search party, began walking towards the keys. As he got closer and closer, he began to be able to see down into the ditch that was just on the other side of the keys. And as soon as he could actually see what was at the bottom of that ditch, he immediately began to gag. He turned around and quickly walked away, unable to process what he had just seen. The other 4 searchers walked up, and they too had a look down into the ditch. They all had a similar horrified reaction. Before long, the whole group was running back to the cabin to tell the park rangers what they had just discovered. When the rangers heard about what was in the forest, they immediately contacted the police. The police then sent an officer to Joie Armstrong's mother's house, which was just outside of San Francisco. When the mother opened the door, the officer told her that they had just gotten a call from Yosemite and that she needed to call them. He then handed her a piece of paper with a phone number on it. Joie's mother was immediately concerned and confused. She tried to get more information from the officer, but he just said, "Look, you're just going to have to call that phone number. I really don't know anything." So eventually she thanked him, shut the door, and went into her kitchen to make the call. She dialed the number. After someone picked up, she introduced herself as Joie's mother. At that point, the person who had answered quickly handed the phone off to someone who sounded much more senior. This new person asked Joie's mother, "Are you aware that your daughter is missing?" Joie's mother said no, she was not aware of that. And then this person very delicately said, "Ma'am, we believe we found your daughter's body near her cabin." Joie's mother's reaction was instant. She said, "Well, did you check her hair? She has red hair. Can you confirm it's really her? Because she's got bright red hair? Can you make sure it's really her?" The person on the other end of the line hesitated for a moment and then just said, "Ma'am, we're not sure if she has red hair or not. We'll get back to you." After this strange and terrifying call finally ended, Joie's mother was completely confused. How could they not know what color her daughter's hair was? It seemed like such an easy way to potentially identify whether or not this was really her daughter. Why would they make her wait for something like that? She was horribly distraught and didn't know what else to do. She was told to just wait for more news, but she couldn't do that. So she began planning a trip out to Yosemite to see for herself what was going on. But the earliest flight she could possibly get was not until very early the next morning. She spent a very restless night, barely sleeping, just praying that the person they had found was not actually her daughter. The next morning, she got up, rushed to the airport, and as she was waiting to board her plane, she grabbed a newspaper from a nearby kiosk. The headline on the front page read, "Naturalist Beheaded at Yosemite," and that's when she understood. That's when she knew why the person on the phone could not tell her whether or not the body was her daughter based on hair color. It was because the body they had found did not have a head. In the time between her getting that phone call and this headline running in the paper, the searchers had found the head. It was located about 27 feet away from the body, hidden under some brush. And they were able to confirm that it was in fact the body of Joie Armstrong. Joie's death was immediately treated as a homicide. And right away, the public began to openly suggest that maybe Joie's murder was connected to the murders of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina from 4 months earlier. This was despite the fact that the police were still saying, "We have our killers for those murders behind bars." Joie's murder is completely unconnected. Luckily, the public and the police did not have to argue for very long about who was right. Because there was a break in Joie's case almost immediately. On the night that Joie went missing, another Yosemite staff member had happened to drive by her cabin. They noticed a distinctive SUV parked outside of her cabin that they didn't recognize. It was a blue 1979 International Scout. As it happened, there were only 2 of these particular types of vehicles registered in all of Yosemite Valley. So, within 24 hours, the police had tracked down one of these 2 vehicles. It was located about 12 miles away from the western entrance of Yosemite, pulled off to the side of a highway. The police pulled up alongside it and parked. They walked up to the vehicle. There was no one inside. But then they noticed a path leading down an embankment off the highway, which led down to a forest where there was a river that people like to swim and fish in. So, the 2 officers decided to head down there and see if maybe the driver was down by the river. They made their way down the path, and sure enough, they came in contact with the driver. He was lying on a rock, completely nude, smoking marijuana. The 2 officers approached him and introduced themselves. The man, who was very well built and good-looking, stood up. He calmly covered himself, took the marijuana out of his mouth, and said, "Hey, what can I do for you guys?" Over the course of their conversation, the police would learn that this guy's name was Cary Stainer. He was 38 years old, and he was the handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel. He told the police that he was not anywhere near Joie's cabin on the night she went missing. The police, for whatever reason, ultimately bought his story. They confiscated his marijuana, walked back up the hill, took some pictures of his car and the tires on his car, and then they left, leaving him down by the river. A couple of days later, some FBI investigators who had been called in on the case analyzed those pictures that the officers had taken of the tires on Cary's car. They compared them to pictures of the tire tracks that had been found at Joie's cabin. And they determined that they were a perfect match. So later that day, which was July 24th, police officers went back out and tracked Cary down again. This time, he was having lunch at one of his favorite spots, a nudist resort about 3 hours northwest of the Cedar Lodge. There, he was arrested on suspicion of murdering Joie Armstrong and was brought in for questioning. As soon as he was walked into the police station and was being booked, Cary dropped a bombshell. He confessed. He confessed to not only murdering Joie Armstrong, but he also confessed to murdering Carol Sund, along with her daughter Julie Sund and Sylvina Palazzo, Julie's friend. And he said he did all of it on his own. He had no other accomplices. This meant the police had never had the killer behind bars. It would turn out that Eugene Dykes, one of their primary suspects, was lying when he made those self-incriminating remarks about him and his half-brother Michael. And as for those synthetic fibers that were found on Eugene and Michael, it turned out those fibers belonged to a very commonly sold type of blanket. They did not definitively tie Michael and Eugene to the crime. So for half a year in 1999, there really was a serial killer just roaming free in Yosemite National Park, just like many of the people who lived in the area. And some people in the media had speculated Cary would go on to give a very detailed and graphic 6-hour-long confession explaining exactly how he went about killing all 4 women. This is his awful story. On the 14th of February, 1999, the day that Carol, Julie, and Sylvina arrived at the Cedar Lodge, Carrie was on his way to his girlfriend's house. His girlfriend, like Carrie, worked at the Cedar Lodge. She was a waitress at their 1950s-style diner. That night, as Carrie walked up the walkway towards her front door, he made up his mind. He was going to act on a dark fantasy he had had since he was 7 years old. And that fantasy was to kill a young woman. His plan that night was to go inside and not only kill his girlfriend, but also kill her 2 young daughters, who were 10 and 11 years old at the time. But when he went inside the house and was about to carry out his plan, he noticed a man in their backyard through one of the windows. He asked his girlfriend who the guy was. She told him that she had hired someone to take care of the property, to cut the grass and do some work in the garden. She said he was going to be there for a little while, but he would stay outside. This totally screwed up Carrie's plan. He was not expecting anyone else to be there that night. So for several hours, Carrie anxiously sat there, constantly looking out the window, waiting for this man to leave so he could kill the 3 people inside. But the worker was taking a long time, and it didn't seem like he was even close to being done. So finally, Carrie left without any explanation, angry and frustrated. He began driving back to the Cedar Lodge, where he had an apartment on the 2nd floor. When he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed a car he hadn't seen earlier in the day. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix. And suddenly, Carrie had this urge to find out who owned that car. Maybe, if he was lucky, it was a woman who owned it, and maybe she was alone. If that was the case, he could still fulfill his fantasy on this woman and not worry about the fact that he couldn't kill his girlfriend and her 2 kids. So Carrie parked his car a little bit away from the red car, and he walked over to the motel room that was right in front of it. It was room 509. He peeked behind one of the curtains into the room, which was all lit up. And he couldn't believe his luck. There were 3 women inside the room. It was Carol, Julie, and Sylvina. Carrie stayed back, continuing to look through the window just to make sure there wasn't a man inside the room with them. After a while of watching them go in and out of the bathroom, and with no men coming into the room from the outside, he was certain they were alone. So, when Carrie finally turned around and left to go back to his own room, he made the decision. He was going to come back the next day and kill them. The next day, February 15th, Carrie secretly followed the 3 women. When they hopped in their rental car and drove to Yosemite, he followed them. He followed them all the way to the parking lot inside the park, and then he waited in the parking lot for hours until the women had finished their wonderful day. He trailed them from the parking lot all the way back to the Cedar Lodge. He secretly followed them when they went to the diner and had hamburgers for dinner. He continued to follow them from a distance, and he watched them rent movies from the front desk. He followed them all the way back to their room. And once he knew they were inside the room for the night, and he had watched long enough to confirm they were not going to leave again, he went back to his own apartment. He got his toolbox. Inside the toolbox was rope, duct tape, a knife, and a gun. Around 11 p.m., he left his apartment, went downstairs, and walked all the way back over to that corner room, room 509, where the women were. He looked in the window, and it was totally dark inside. He assumed they must be sleeping, and he knocked on the door. A few minutes later, Carol came to the door. She very cautiously opened it just a crack, leaving the chain lock still attached. She looked through the small opening at Carrie and said, "Hi, can I help you?" Carrie held up his handyman toolbox and pointed to his name tag that identified him as the Cedar Lodge handyman. He said, "Hi, ma'am. Sorry to disturb you so late, but there's a leak in the room right above yours, and I need to make sure the leak is not coming down into your room. Can I just come in and have a quick look? I'll be out of here in a minute." Carol, apparently, was not buying it. She said, "Look, I haven't seen any leaks in this room. I don't think there is one. But even if there is, can it please wait until tomorrow? We're all trying to sleep." But Carrie was very persistent. And Carrie was known to be very charming and very disarming. Eventually, he talked his way into the room. He walked inside, past the bed where the 2 teenage girls were still sleeping. He went into the bathroom, and for a few minutes, he pretended to fiddle around with the plumbing, while Carol stood right outside the bathroom door looking in at him. Then, at some point, Carrie reached into his toolbox, pulled out the gun, and aimed it at Carol. He said, "Stay calm. I'm not going to hurt you. This is just a robbery." Carol most likely believed that their best chance of getting out of this situation was to just comply. Do what he says, let him rob them, and then he would leave, and they would be okay. So Carol very dutifully went back into the room, and she quietly woke up her daughter and her daughter's friend. Before long, Carrie had tied up all three of them. He put the two teenagers in the bathroom and shut the door. Then he put Carol on the bed. He then proceeded to assault Carol before strangling her to death with more rope. After she was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel room and put her in the trunk of her own rental car. After he shut the trunk, he went back inside the motel room. He went to the bathroom, opened the door, and he grabbed Sylvina, who was crying. He pulled her out, leaving Julie alone, cowering inside the bathroom by herself. He shut the door behind her, and then he brought Sylvina over to the bed, where he assaulted her before strangling her as well with additional rope. After Sylvina was dead, he carried her body outside and put her in the trunk of the rental car, along with Carol's body. After that, he went back inside the motel room one more time. He opened the bathroom door, grabbed Julie, pulled her out, and proceeded to assault her as well. But afterwards, he did not strangle her to death. Instead, he walked her back into the bathroom and shut and locked the door. While she was in there, wondering what was going to happen to her, what had happened to her mom, what had happened to her friend, he proceeded to clean up the room. He tidied it up, moved all of their luggage out of the room, and put it into the rental car. After he was satisfied with the cleanup, he went back inside, opened the bathroom door, and pulled Julie out. He had her stand right outside the bathroom, as he then proceeded to clean up the bathroom itself, but he purposefully left a couple of wet towels on the ground to give the impression that the women had left in a bit of a hurry. After that, he grabbed Julie and walked her out to the car. He sat her down in the front passenger seat. She only had a blanket wrapped around her at this point. And then Carrie hopped in the driver's seat and began driving off into the night. Julie must have been beyond terrified. She had no idea where her mom was. She had no idea where her friend was. She had no idea they were actually dead, locked in the trunk right behind her. The man that had just assaulted her for hours was now driving her into the darkness, and she had no idea where she was going. All she had was a thin blanket around her. It's just beyond brutal to imagine what that poor girl was going through. For 2 hours, Carrie drove them west along the highway in the middle of the night. And the whole time, he was trying to make small talk with this poor girl, trying to tell her that she was going to be okay and that her mom and her friend were going to be okay too. Finally, he pulled off the highway, drove down some switchbacks, and into the big, empty parking lot of Don Pedro Lake. He parked the car. There were no other cars around. It was still dark out, the sun hadn't come up yet. He got out and told Julie to get out of the car. But Julie was so scared, she was frozen. She couldn't move. She couldn't even get out of the car on her own. So Carrie got out, walked around to her side, opened the door, and he scooped her up in his arms like you might hold a baby. He walked with her up a trail all the way to an overlook that was well away from any prying eyes in the parking lot. Once he was out of sight, he took her blanket off and laid it down on the ground. And then he proceeded to assault her again. As the sun began to come up over the lake, Carrie realized that he had to end his fantasy and begin to cover his tracks. So he stopped what he was doing. He stood up, reached down, and pulled Julie up to her feet. She was standing with her back to the lake. And as he was looking at her, he said, "I love you." And then he pulled out his knife and he cut her throat. He then pushed her body down the hillside, where she tumbled, and finally came to a stop underneath some bushes, where she died. Carrie grabbed the blanket from the ground and walked back to the rental car in the lot. There was still nobody out there. He hopped inside, drove out of the lot, and drove for 1 hour north until he was deep inside a forest. He pulled down a logging road where he abandoned the car. After he ditched it, he walked back up to the highway and caught a cab back to the Cedar Lodge. He would come back to the car and torch it 2 days later. He would also make a special trip to Modesto, where he would drop Carol's wallet in the middle of a road near a high school in order to confuse investigators. A month later, when Carol and Sylvina's bodies were found in the back of the burned-out car, Carrie would send that handwritten note to the police, the one with the map of where Julie's body was, and that horrible message, "We had fun with this one," referencing Julie. He sent that to the police to further confuse them. He wanted them to believe that there was more than one person perpetrating these murders. Months would go by, and the police, despite questioning Carrie along with all the other Cedar Lodge staff members, never considered him a suspect. This was for two main reasons. One, they really thought he was just a nice, normal guy and couldn't be capable of committing such violence against three women. And two, and this was probably the most important reason, the police discovered that when Carrie was a child, his younger brother had been kidnapped by a pedophile and held for 7 years. Although his brother was ultimately returned to the family alive, that experience was incredibly traumatic and devastating to Carrie and his whole family. So the police figured there was no way this guy would ever abduct or harm other people because he knew firsthand how traumatic and awful that is for the victim and the victim's family. If anything, Carrie seemed like the type of guy who would go out of his way to protect and save those three women from being abducted or harmed. In July of that year, 4 months after the three women's bodies were discovered, Carrie, who believed he had completely gotten away with murder, and to that point he really had, was just driving around Yosemite. He was reveling in the fact that he had gotten to live out his fantasy and not get punished for it. That's when he noticed a woman way off in the distance, walking in and out of a cabin that was fairly isolated. So he drove his 1979 blue International Scout down a forested road, and he reached a meadow. He looked across the meadow, and now that the woman was even closer, he could tell she was clearly loading things into her truck. She was going back and forth, back and forth. And he's watching her, wondering if there's anybody else helping her, because this cabin was very secluded. And he's thinking, if she's alone, I might be able to kill her too. After a while, when he only saw her loading things into her white pickup truck, he decided he was going to go kill her. He drove across the meadow and pulled up right next to her truck. He got out and introduced himself. And the woman was so completely caught off guard by this random, strange man showing up in the middle of the night, suddenly acting so friendly that kind of reflexively, in an effort not to be rude, she said, "Hi, I'm Joey Armstrong. Nice to meet you. What are you doing down here?" Carrie proceeded to spark up some small talk. He asked her if she believed in Bigfoot, and they kind of got on this tangent about Bigfoot. Then, at some point, Carrie drew a pistol, aimed it at her, and said, "Go inside your cabin." So Joie put her hands up, and she went inside the cabin like she was told. Carrie followed her inside. He then bound her wrists and her mouth with duct tape. He then ordered her to get back inside of his SUV. Once she was sitting inside the front passenger seat, Carrie got in the driver's seat and began leaving the cabin, headed back out towards the road he came in on. As he's speeding across the meadow, Joie leaps headfirst out of the window of the moving car and smashes onto the ground. She immediately jumps up and just starts running back towards the cabin. Carrie jams on the brakes, hops out, and starts chasing after her. Joie manages to get fairly close to the tree line right behind the cabin before Carrie ultimately grabs her and tackles her to the ground. Joie was viciously trying to fight Carrie off of her, and Carrie, kind of in a panic, drew his knife. He tried to slash at her, but Joie tucked her chin, protecting her neck from being stabbed. So, frustrated, Carrie just stood up. He grabbed Joie by the hair and began hauling her towards the forest behind her cabin. The whole time, Joie was doing everything in her power to try to escape, but she just couldn't. Finally, they got inside the woods, and Carrie dragged her into a ditch. Once she was down at the bottom, he put his foot on the top of her head and forced it back, forcibly exposing her throat. And at that point, he pulled out his knife, and he began to cut. Afterwards, Carrie considered keeping Joie's head, but ultimately he would try to hide it in some bushes nearby. After Carrie attempted to cover up some of the blood in the area with some branches and leaves, he left the forest and went back to his SUV. He didn't even attempt to tidy up the scene. He left her truck as it was. He left her cabin as it was. He just hopped in his SUV and drove back to the Cedar Lodge. Carey would tell police that as soon as he killed Joy Armstrong, all he wanted to do was go kill his girlfriend and her two young daughters, the 10 and 11-year-old. But police caught him before he could carry out that attack. Cary Stayner, who never showed any remorse for his victims, was ultimately sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution in San Quentin Prison in Northern California. One of the more distressing aspects of this case was Carol's camera. It was found intact near the burned-out car in the woods. The police developed the picture on the camera in the hopes that there would be some clue as to who murdered them. But it would turn out there wasn't any usable evidence on the camera. It was just pictures of Carol, her daughter, and Sylvina having this wonderful, happy time in Yosemite, and that was it. But after Cary confessed to what he did to these poor women, those pictures take on a whole new, much darker meaning. In the final 8 images on that camera roll, we know that Cary Stayner was either literally watching these women secretly at the time the picture was taken, or he was patiently waiting nearby for them to return. The final image that was taken on that camera was taken by Julie. It's a picture of her mother sitting on one bed and her friend Sylvina sitting on the other bed as they were getting ready to turn out the lights and go to sleep. That picture was taken just moments before Cary knocked on their door. Before you click away tonight, just remember this. Somewhere in a police evidence box, there still exists a roll of photographs from that trip. Smiling faces. Snow-covered mountains. 3 people laughing together, completely unaware that the man who would murder them was already watching from the shadows. And in the very last photo ever taken, Carol and Sylvina are sitting quietly inside room 509, just moments before the knock came at the door. Until next time, sleep well. Sometimes, the choices we make and the secrets we keep can completely alter the course of human lives. In some cases, these choices are driven by a deep, aching desire to heal a broken past and find a way to make things right. In other cases, they are driven by greed, power, and a shocking level of corruption that completely blinds a person to the value of human life. And in the most tragic cases, they are driven by a quiet, toxic malice that operates completely outside the boundaries of the law, leaving behind a devastation that can never truly be repaired. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that show just how unpredictable and sometimes how utterly terrifying the human experience can be. We begin in the summer of 2007. A 60-year-old man named Michael Dick was living a very quiet, comfortable life in Bow, which is located in East London. Michael was a semi-retired carpenter, and if you were to look at his day-to-day routine, it was pretty normal. He spent most of his time helping out around the house, visiting with his close friends, and being with his family. He was well-liked in his neighborhood, which was a peaceful, safe place to live. But even though his life seemed complete on the surface, Michael was harboring a deep, quiet sadness that had been growing inside of him for a very long time. 10 years earlier, back in 1997, Michael had gone through a very messy, painful divorce with his first wife. At the time of the split, they had a daughter together named Lisa, who was 21 years old. When the divorce was finalized, Michael decided he needed a fresh start to escape the bitterness of the separation. He packed up his things and moved about an hour and a half south down to Bow in East London. But his ex-wife and his daughter, Lisa, stayed behind in the family home, which was located in a quiet, historic town called Sudbury in the county of Suffolk, England. Because the divorce had been so hostile and bitter, the communication between Michael and his old family completely broke down. There were no phone calls, no letters, and no updates. As the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, Michael completely lost touch with his daughter Lisa. He did not know what she was doing with her life, whether she went to university, if she got married, or if she was even happy. It was like she had vanished from his world entirely. Fast forward 10 years to 2007. Michael is sitting in his home, and suddenly he is hit with this overwhelming, crushing wave of grief. He realized that a whole decade had passed, and he had missed out on his first daughter's entire young adulthood. The guilt of letting those 10 years slip away became absolutely too much for him to bear. He could not stop thinking about her. So he sat down with his current wife and his two younger daughters, and he told them that he had to go find Lisa. He needed to apologize for the lost time, and he wanted to rebuild a relationship with her if she would let him. His family was incredibly supportive. They told him he absolutely had to do it and that they would help him in any way they could. But the problem was, Michael had absolutely no idea where Lisa was. He did not have her phone number, he did not have an email address, and he had no way of contacting his ex-wife to ask for help because they had cut all ties. The only piece of information he had was the physical address of the brick house they had lived in 10 years ago in Sudbury. And so, in August of 2007, Michael decided that this old house was going to be his starting point. He got into the car with his two younger daughters, and they made the 90-minute drive north to Sudbury. When they arrived, Michael navigated through the familiar streets until he found his old neighborhood. It was a beautiful, quiet street lined with classic brick houses on both sides. He slowly drove down the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, until he spotted his old family home. He pulled the car over, parked right out front, and just sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. His heart was pounding with a mix of hope and sheer anxiety. He stepped out of the car alone, walked up the stone path, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door. After a few moments, the door opened. But the person standing there was not his ex-wife, and it was not Lisa. It was a completely different family who had moved in years after Michael left. Michael politely explained who he was and who he was looking for, but the new owners told him that they had bought the house from someone else and had no idea where the previous occupants had moved. They wished him the best of luck, but they had absolutely no information to give him. Michael thanked them, walked slowly back to his car, and sat in the driver's seat, feeling completely crushed. He looked at his daughters and told them that the trail was completely cold and he did not know what to do next. But his daughters refused to let him give up. They suggested that they just drive around Sudbury for a while. Maybe they would get incredibly lucky and spot Lisa walking down the street, or maybe just seeing the town would spark an idea. So they spent the next couple of hours just aimlessly driving around the streets of Sudbury, looking out the windows and talking about what they should do next. As they drove, they came to the realization that their best bet at finding Lisa was to get some sort of story in the local newspaper. They hoped that if they could get an article published, Lisa, or perhaps someone who knew her, would see it and contact Michael. So they drove to the headquarters of the local paper, the Suffolk Free Press, and went inside. They managed to speak to a reporter and explained Michael's situation. The reporter thought it was a very touching, interesting human interest story and agreed to write a small feature about Michael's search. The reporter, along with a photographer, brought Michael and his two younger daughters outside onto the street. The photographer had them stand together, and he took a picture of them. The reporter told Michael that in the next edition of the paper, which would run in just a few days, they would publish this picture along with a write-up about his search and his contact information. Michael thanked them profusely, feeling a tiny spark of hope. He and his daughters got back in the car and headed back to Bow, East London to wait. Now, what Michael did not know was that at that exact same time, Lisa was actually beginning to think about finding him too. Lisa was now 31 years old, she was married, she had 3 kids of her own, and she had moved out of Sudbury to a neighboring town. She had been talking to her mother and her friends about how she should go about finding her dad because she wanted her kids to have a relationship with him. But like Michael, she did not have his contact information, she did not have his phone number, and when she searched for him on social media, he was not on there. One day in August, Lisa was at her office. She went into the break room to get a drink, and she saw a copy of the Suffolk Free Press sitting on the coffee table. She picked it up and began casually flipping through the pages. Suddenly, she stopped. She saw a picture of herself. In the background of the main photo, she could clearly see herself and her mother walking along the street. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days earlier to talk to her mom about how to find her dad, and they had walked down that very street. But then Lisa looked at the main subjects of the photo, the people standing in the foreground. It was a middle-aged man and two teenage girls. She stared at the man's face and nearly fell off her chair. It was her father, Michael, and her two stepsisters, whom she had never met. She looked at the caption for the photo and read the article. It explained that this man was desperately searching for his daughter, Lisa, whom he had not seen in 10 years. Purely by chance, on the only day Lisa had been in Sudbury talking to her mother about finding her father, she had been walking literally 100 feet behind her father and her stepsisters as they were having their picture taken for the newspaper ad. The photographer had captured all of them in the same frame without even realizing it. Lisa immediately read the article, got her father's contact information, and reached out to him. Initially, when Michael answered the phone and Lisa told him who she was and how she found him, he actually thought it was a scam. He did not believe it was actually her. But eventually she convinced him and he drove right back to Sudbury. They had an incredibly emotional reunion, and Michael got to meet his grandchildren for the very first time. Today, they are still a close part of each other's lives, all because of an unbelievable 1-in-a-million coincidence captured in a single newspaper photograph. That is a story of a long search ending in a beautiful, almost miraculous way. But our next story takes us to a very different part of the world, where a man's search for fame and power led to something incredibly dark and deeply disturbing. If you were to picture the Amazon rainforest in your head, you would probably imagine a dense, green, tropical wilderness filled with exotic animals and winding rivers. And you would be right. That is a very accurate representation of the Amazon. But what a lot of people do not know is that the Amazon rainforest is also home to a massive, bustling city. It is called Manaus, and it sits right in the middle of the rainforest, right along the banks of the Amazon River. Manaus is a city of extremes, and unfortunately, it happens to be one of the most violent places in the entire world. In Manaus, the drug trade and gang violence are extremely prevalent. All it takes is walking down the wrong street or crossing the wrong person, and you can get shot or stabbed in broad daylight with virtually nothing anyone can do to stop it. The police are often overwhelmed, underfunded, and sometimes even complicit in the chaos. In 1989, a 31-year-old former police officer named Wallace Souza decided that he wanted to do something about the state of his hometown. He wanted to make a television show that would show people what it was actually like to live in Manaus. Now, there were other crime shows in Brazil at the time, but they often censored the most graphic content. They would blur out the bodies or avoid showing the true horror of the crime scenes. Wallace decided he was not going to do that. He felt that the only way to expose the harsh reality of life in Manaus was to show everything without any filter. So, that year, he launched a show called Canal Livre, which translates to Free Channel. True to his word, there was absolutely no filter on what went on the air. The show was shocking, raw, and incredibly graphic. Viewers were given a front row seat to freshly murdered victims, lying in the road, slumped over chairs in restaurants, or dead behind the steering wheels of their cars. The cameramen would zoom in on the fatal injuries, the blood spatter, and the faces of the deceased. They would show the grieving family members crying out in pain, completely raw and unedited. But in between these very dark, violent segments about gang killings and drug deals gone wrong, Canal Livre also had a much lighter, almost bizarre side. They would bring on local artists to talk about their work, or they would focus on down-on-their-luck families that needed help, using the show to raise money for them. And then, for seemingly no reason at all, there was a recurring segment where a puppet character would get into physical fights with a man selling bread. It was a totally strange, chaotic spectacle, and the people of Manaus absolutely loved it. Eventually, the show became incredibly popular not just in Manaus, but across all of Brazil. Because Wallace was often on camera hosting the show, he became extremely famous and highly recognizable. When he walked down the streets of Manaus, people would see him and literally start clapping and cheering for him. He was seen as a hero who was brave enough to show the truth that the government wanted to hide. As his popularity grew, Wallace decided that he did not just want to report on crime, he wanted to fight it from a position of authority. On the air, he would constantly berate the government for failing to protect its citizens, and he would mock the police for their inability to catch criminals. Off the air, he decided to run for political office. He campaigned hard on a platform of law and order, promising to clean up the streets of Manaus. He was elected with a massive majority, and he quickly became one of the most beloved, influential, and trusted public figures in all of Brazil. However, over the years, there was one very strange thing about Canal Livre that some people began to notice. It was a detail that was hard to ignore, and it was most obvious in a now famous episode that aired in the mid-2000s. This particular episode opens with a Canal Livre reporter making their way through a dense patch of jungle. A cameraman is filming them from behind as they push branches out of the way and carefully step over the thick underbrush. Up ahead, there is a small clearing, and standing in this clearing is a third person who is looking down at something on the ground. The reporter finally makes his way into the clearing, and the cameraman follows, pointing the camera down at the ground. What you see on the ground looks like a black, charred log that is still smoking. But as the cameraman zooms in, you realize it is not a log at all. It is a human being. The body is badly burned and still actively smoking, meaning this person had been set on fire just minutes before the camera crew arrived. It was a horrifying sight. But then, the reporter starts talking about the victim with an incredible amount of detail. He tells the audience that the victim is a man, that he had not been shot, and that he had been doused with gasoline and burned alive. The problem was, the police had not even arrived at the scene yet. No medical examiner had looked at the body, and because the body was so badly charred, it was virtually impossible to tell just by looking at it whether the victim was male, whether there were gunshot wounds, or what accelerant had been used. When people began to question how Canal Livre always managed to arrive at these crime scenes so quickly, and how they had so much detailed information before the police, Wallace had a quick answer. He told them that they were simply a very popular show with a huge network of informants, that people called them before they called the police, and that they constantly monitored police radios and the city morgue. For a long time, people accepted this explanation. But everything changed in October of 2008. That month, the police arrested a former Manaus police officer who went by the name Moa. He was accused of committing 9 murders and was thrown into jail. Despite the incredibly serious charges against him, Moa seemed completely unfazed. He acted like a man who knew he had powerful connections on the outside, someone who would step in at any moment and get him out of prison. But as the weeks went on, nobody came to save Moa. He just continued to sit in his cell, and eventually the reality of his situation began to sink in. He realized he had been abandoned. So he decided to start talking, and the story he told would shock the entire nation of Brazil. Moa admitted to the police that he had killed several people. But then he said that he was just a hitman. He claimed that the person who was hiring him to commit these murders was none other than Wallace Souza. The police began a massive, secret investigation. What they discovered was absolutely mind-blowing. It turned out that Wallace Souza had started Canal Livre with good intentions, but as the show became massively popular, it gave him an immense amount of power and influence. And that power corrupted him completely. Wallace had secretly formed his own powerful drug cartel. In order to protect his drug territory, eliminate his rivals, and boost his television show's ratings, Wallace had started hiring hitmen like Moa to assassinate rival gang members. Wallace would tell the hitmen exactly who to kill, where to do it, and at what exact time. Once the hit was planned, Wallace would coordinate with his news producers. He would send his camera crews to the exact location of the planned murder, timing it so they would arrive either right as the crime was happening or immediately after. This allowed Canal Livre to get the absolute most graphic, exclusive footage before any other news outlet and long before the police could even secure the scene. They were literally creating the news they were reporting on. It took the police a full year to compile enough evidence, but in October of 2009, they finally charged Wallace Souza with murder, conspiracy, and drug trafficking. Wallace initially went on the run, but he eventually turned himself in, maintaining his innocence and claiming that he was the victim of a political conspiracy. However, Wallace would never stand trial. Before his case could go before a judge, he suffered a massive heart attack and died in prison in 2010. Because of his death, the full extent of his crimes was never fully revealed, and we will never know exactly how many people he had killed for the sake of his television ratings. But investigators were able to prove that at least 3 of the victims shown on Canal Livre had been killed directly on Wallace's orders, including the man who had been burned alive in the jungle. But the story does not end there. The person who paid the ultimate price for exposing this massive conspiracy was Moa, the hitman who had blown the whistle on Wallace. On New Year's Day in 2017, a massive violent prison riot broke out at the facility where Moa was being held. A powerful crime syndicate overran the guards and took control of the prison, and they had a specific list of targets they wanted to eliminate. One of those targets was Moa, whom they viewed as a traitor for cooperating with the police. An angry mob of armed inmates made their way to Moa's cell. When they found him, Moa was pressed flat against the back wall of his cell, as far away from the bars as he could possibly get, pleading for his life. The mob, armed with machetes and knives, began hacking at the cell door, trying to break the lock to get inside and cut him to pieces. But the lock was too strong, and they could not get the door open. Realizing they could not reach him with their blades, they decided to do something else. They reached through the bars with a lighter and set Moa's mattress on fire. The flames quickly spread, filling the tiny cell with thick, toxic smoke and intense heat. With nowhere to run and no way to escape, Moa was trapped. He was burned alive inside his cell, suffering the exact same horrific fate that he and Wallace had inflicted on their victims years before. This is a terrifying example of how greed and a desire for control can lead to absolute horror. But sometimes, control does not come from a drug cartel or a television show. Sometimes it comes from someone you trust completely, someone you consider to be your very best friend. And that brings us to our third and final story, which took place in Sydney, Australia. In 2010, an 18-year-old girl named Renee Marsden was living in Sydney with her parents and her 3 siblings. Renee was a very bright, outgoing, and popular young woman who had a large circle of friends. She was also incredibly close with her family, especially with her mother, Teresa. Teresa had given birth to Renee when she was only 19 years old. Because of their relatively close age gap as Renee grew into a young woman, their relationship evolved from a traditional mother-daughter dynamic into a deep, trusting friendship. Renee saw her mother as her ultimate confidant. She would come home and tell Teresa absolutely everything that was going on in her life, from her daily routines to her deepest secrets. In 2010, Renee was going through a very difficult time. She had been dating a young man for nearly 2 years, and she was madly in love with him. But one day, she discovered a series of text messages that made it clear he was cheating on her and did not really care about her. Renee was completely heartbroken. She confronted her boyfriend with the messages, but he completely denied sending them. He swore up and down that he had never cheated on her, that he loved her, and that he had no idea where those messages had come from. But Renee, feeling betrayed and confused, did not believe him. She felt she had no choice but to break up with him. During this painful period, Renee spent hours talking to her mother, crying and trying to process the end of her relationship. Teresa did her best to comfort her daughter, telling her that time heals all wounds and that she would eventually find the right person who would treat her with the respect she deserved. For a couple of weeks, Renee was deeply depressed. She barely wanted to leave her room. But then, quite suddenly, she came home from work one day and walked through the front door with a massive smile on her face. She was practically radiating happiness, which was a huge contrast to how she had been acting. Teresa immediately noticed the change and asked her what had happened to put her in such a great mood. Renee smiled and told her mother that she had met a new guy. Teresa was thrilled to see her daughter happy again, and she eagerly asked who this new person was. Renee explained that his name was Braden Spiteri. He was 23 years old, and he came from a very wealthy, prominent family. He had graduated from the King's School, which is an extremely prestigious boys' school in Sydney, and his father owned a highly successful construction company that Braden was set to inherit. Renee described him as handsome, kind, and absolutely perfect. Teresa asked how they had met, and Renee explained that her best friend, Camilla Zidon, had introduced them. Camilla and Renee had been best friends since high school, and Camilla was always over at the Marsden house, so Teresa knew her very well. Renee told her mother that Braden was actually Camilla's ex-boyfriend, but they had dated a long time ago, and there were absolutely no lingering feelings between them. They were just good friends now. According to Renee, Camilla had seen how depressed Renee was after her breakup, and she wanted to help her find happiness again. So, Camilla had set her up with Braden. When Teresa heard this, a small red flag went up in her mind. She knew that dating a best friend's ex-boyfriend could easily lead to drama and hurt feelings, even if everyone claimed to be fine with it. She looked at Renee and asked if she really thought it was a good idea to get involved with Camilla's ex. But Renee quickly brushed her concerns aside, saying that Camilla was completely supportive and just wanted her to be happy. Still feeling a bit uneasy, Teresa asked to see a picture of this new guy. Renee pulled out her phone and showed her a photo of Braden. He was indeed a very handsome young man with a bright, welcoming smile. But as Teresa looked closer at the photo, she noticed something that made her uncomfortable. In the picture, Camilla was leaning her head heavily on Braden's shoulder, looking very much like his girlfriend. Teresa kept her thoughts to herself, but she could not shake the feeling that this situation was complicated and potentially dangerous. Over the next few weeks and months, Renee's relationship with Braden seemed to blossom rapidly. They were texting each other constantly, day and night. Renee had her phone out almost 24 hours a day, smiling at her screen as she exchanged messages with Braden. But as the months went by, Teresa noticed something odd. Renee and Braden had still not met up in person since they began officially dating. Every single time they made plans to meet, something would come up at the last minute. Either Braden would have an emergency at work, or Renee would have a family conflict. It was always some seemingly legitimate excuse, but it happened every single time. Eventually, the couple stopped trying to arrange face-to-face meetings altogether. It was as if they had built this incredibly intense, emotional relationship entirely through their phone screens, and actually meeting in person had become too intimidating or awkward. They were completely content just living in this digital world together. This unusual text-only relationship continued for nearly a year until January of 2012, when a massive tragedy struck. Braden was involved in a horrific motorcycle accident. He survived the crash, but his passenger, who was also his best friend, a young man named Richie, did not survive. He was killed instantly. The police investigated the accident and determined that Braden had been driving recklessly, and he was subsequently charged with manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. When Teresa heard about the accident, she felt a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt terrible for the young man who had lost his life and for Braden's family. But on the other hand, a protective, motherly part of her felt a sense of relief. She assumed that with Braden going to prison for 2 years, the relationship would naturally come to an end. She hoped that Renee would finally move on and find someone she could actually spend time with in the real world. But that is not what happened. Braden was sent to Goulburn Prison, a high-security facility located about 2 hours south of Sydney. Shortly after he arrived, Renee informed her family that Braden's family had somehow managed to smuggle a mobile phone into the prison for him. And just like that, their constant texting resumed, as if nothing had changed. Renee's family was deeply unhappy about this. They tried to talk to her, telling her that she was wasting her youth on a man in prison and that this relationship was heading down a very dark and difficult path. But Renee refused to listen. She was completely devoted to Braden. In fact, over the next several months, their relationship only grew more intense. They made plans to get married as soon as Braden was released, which was scheduled for late 2013. Renee was overjoyed and began throwing herself into wedding preparations. She spent hours online buying a beautiful wedding tiara on eBay, booking a professional photographer, and even contacting the Greek consulate to see if Braden, as a convicted felon, would be allowed to enter Greece for their planned honeymoon. But then, in August of 2013, just 2 months before Braden's scheduled release date, everything began to unravel in a very strange way. One afternoon, Teresa received a text message on her phone. It was from Braden, which was highly unusual because he rarely communicated with Teresa directly. The message was frantic. It told Teresa that she needed to check on Renee immediately because she was talking about ending her life. Terrified, Teresa ran straight to Renee's bedroom. She found Renee sitting quietly on her bed. Teresa sat down beside her, put a comforting hand on her shoulder, and asked if she was okay and what was going on. Renee looked up, seemingly confused, and said that she was fine, and asked why her mother was asking. Teresa showed her the text message from Braden. As soon as Renee saw the screen, her face fell. She let out a heavy sigh, looked at her mother, and said that they had just broken up and that their relationship was completely over. She insisted that she was not going to hurt herself, but that she was just incredibly sad. Teresa felt a sudden wave of relief mixed with deep sympathy for her daughter. She knew how painful breakups were, but she also believed that this was the best possible outcome for Renee's future. She stayed with Renee for a while, talking and comforting her until Renee seemed to calm down. Renee then told her mother that she wanted to go out that night with her friends to try and clear her head and forget about the breakup. Teresa thought this was a healthy idea. She sat on the bed and watched as Renee stood in front of the mirror, putting on her makeup and getting dressed up. When she was ready, Renee gave her mother a tight hug, kissed her on the cheek, and said she would see her later. Then she walked out the door. A few hours later, Teresa's phone buzzed. It was a text message from Renee. But as Teresa read the message, her heart sank. The text began with Renee saying how much she loved her mother and how sorry she was for the pain she was about to cause her. She wrote that if Teresa ever wanted to talk to her, she just had to call out her name and she would be there. Teresa was instantly gripped by panic. She did not fully understand what the message meant, but she knew it sounded like a goodbye. She immediately dialed Renee's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She called again and again, but there was no answer. She sent a desperate text message begging Renee to call her back, but she received no response. In a state of pure terror, Teresa called Camilla, Renee's best friend. She asked Camilla if she had heard from Renee or knew where she was. Camilla sounded shocked and told Teresa that she had actually just received a very similar frightening text message from Renee that simply said she loved her and was sorry. The two women decided they had to find her immediately. They met up and spent the next several hours driving frantically all over Sydney, checking every place they thought Renee might go. but there was no sign of her anywhere. Eventually, feeling completely helpless, they drove back to Teresa's house. By this time, Teresa's husband and Renee's siblings were all awake, gathered in the living room, waiting in agonizing silence for any news. At around 9:30 that night, there was a loud knock on the front door. Teresa ran to open it, hoping it was Renee. But instead, she was met by two police officers. The officers explained that they had found Renee's car parked in an unauthorized area, but she was not inside or anywhere near the vehicle. They had come to the family home to see if they knew where she was. When the family explained these suicidal text messages, the officers' faces grew grave. Without hesitating, Teresa and her husband ran to their car and drove straight to the location where the police had found Renee's vehicle. The car was parked in a beautiful but notorious area of Sydney known as the Gap. The Gap is a famous peninsula characterized by steep sandstone cliffs that drop directly into the churning ocean below. It is a place of incredible natural beauty, but it is also tragically well known as a site where many people go to end their lives. When the parents arrived, they rushed to Renee's car and searched it, but it was empty. They began running up and down the paved walking paths that lined the edge of the cliffs, calling out Renee's name into the dark, windy night. But there was no answer, only the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. As Teresa searched, she climbed up to one of the highest lookout points on the cliff. There, on the ground, right in front of the safety fence designed to keep people away from the edge, she found something that shattered her heart. Placed neatly side by side on the gravel were Renee's flat black shoes. The police conducted an extensive search of the cliffs and the water below that night, but because of the darkness and the rough sea conditions, they could find no sign of Renee. The following day, investigators located a security camera that was positioned to monitor that specific section of the Gap. They pulled the footage from the previous night and began to watch. On the video, they saw Renee. She was walking slowly up the trail, alone in the dark. She stopped near the lookout point, bent down, took off her shoes, and placed them neatly together on the ground. Then she climbed over the safety fence. The fence was set back a few feet from the actual drop-off. The footage showed Renee taking a few steps toward the sheer edge and peeking over into the abyss. She looked visibly terrified. She took a few steps backward, pressing her back flat against the safety fence. She pulled out her phone and stood there for a few moments, typing. This was the moment she sent the 3 final text messages. One was to her mother, one was to Camilla, and one was to Braden. Once the messages were sent, Renee took her phone and threw it far out over the edge, watching as it disappeared into the ocean. Then she sat down on the ground and began to shimmy herself slowly forward toward the edge of the cliff until she went out of the camera's frame. It was clear to the investigators that Renee had jumped to her death. Despite search efforts, her body was never recovered from the ocean. The family was absolutely destroyed. They could not understand how a young woman who had been planning her wedding, buying a tiara, and looking forward to her future just days before could suddenly decide to end her life. They were convinced that the key to understanding her death lay with Braden Spiteri. They believed that whatever had happened during their sudden breakup had pushed her over the edge. They tried to contact Braden, but his phone was disconnected. Desperate for answers, they contacted the police and asked them to arrange a meeting with Braden at Goulburn Prison, where he was supposedly serving his sentence. The police agreed and contacted the administration at Goulburn Prison to inquire about an inmate named Braden Spiteri. But when the prison officials checked their records, they told the police something that sent a chill down their spines. They had no record of anyone named Braden Spiteri. Not only was he not currently at the prison, but no one by that name had ever been incarcerated there. The police began a deeper investigation into this mysterious young man. They traced the phone records, the social media accounts, and the IP addresses associated with Braden Spiteri. And what they uncovered was a level of deception that was almost impossible to comprehend. Braden Spiteri did not exist. He was a completely fictitious person. And the person who had created him, the person who had been texting Renee day and night for nearly 2 years, pretending to be the love of her life, was none other than her best friend, Camilla Zaiden. The photograph that Renee had shown her mother, the one where Camilla was resting her head on Braden's shoulder, was not a photo of Camilla's ex-boyfriend. It was just a photo of a completely random guy that Camilla had met once at a nightclub and asked to take a picture with. She had used his face to create this entire elaborate lie. As the police dug deeper into the girl's history, a horrifying pattern of toxic, obsessive control began to emerge. It turned out that Camilla had been deeply, pathologically possessive of Renee ever since they met in high school. She did not want anyone else to have Renee's attention or affection. When Renee had started dating her previous boyfriend of 2 years, Camilla had grown incredibly jealous. In order to destroy that relationship and regain control over Renee, Camilla had secretly fabricated the cheating text messages. She had created fake accounts, sent those messages to herself or to Renee, and then convinced Renee that her boyfriend was a liar and a cheat. Trusting her best friend completely, Renee had broken off the relationship exactly as Camilla had planned. Then, seeing how devastated Renee was, Camilla had swooped in to play the hero. She created the persona of Braden Spiteri, a wealthy, perfect man who would heal Renee's broken heart. Camilla had spent the next 2 years living a double life. She would spend the day hanging out with Renee in person as her best friend, and then spend the night texting Renee as Braden, whispering sweet, romantic things to her through a fake phone number. But the facade began to crack in June of 2013. During an intense text conversation with Braden, Renee had opened up about her frustrations with her real-life friend, Camilla. She told Braden that Camilla had become incredibly toxic, mean, and controlling, and that she was seriously considering ending her friendship with her. On the other end of the phone, Camilla was reading these messages. She was furious. She realized that despite all her efforts to control Renee, Renee was starting to see through her and wanted to push her away. Camilla's obsession turned into a dark desire for revenge. She decided that if she could not control Renee, she would destroy her. And she would use the character of Braden to do it. On the afternoon of the 5th of August, 2013, Renee was out having lunch with a coworker. She was happy, planning her future wedding, when she suddenly received a cold, abrupt text message from Braden out of the blue saying that he needed a break from her and that it was over. Renee was completely blindsided and devastated. She tried calling him repeatedly, but the call would not go through. Desperate and confused, she decided to do something she had never done before. She called Goulburn Prison directly, hoping to speak to a guard or an administrator who could help her get in touch with Braden. The call was placed at 2:45 that afternoon. While we do not know the exact details of the conversation, it is almost certain that the prison staff informed Renee that there was no inmate named Braden Spiteri at their facility. In that single, horrifying moment, the illusion shattered. Renee would have realized that the man she had loved for 2 years, the man she was planning to marry, was a total lie. And as she began to connect the dots, she would have realized that the person behind this cruel, elaborate deception was her very best friend, Camilla. The embarrassment, the shock, and the absolute betrayal were too much for Renee's 18-year-old mind to process. She felt completely violated, foolish, and deeply broken. She could not bring herself to confess this massive, humiliating truth to her mother, who was her confidant. The weight of the realization was so heavy that she felt she could not survive it. And so, later that evening, she walked out of her house and made the tragic journey to the Gap Cliffs. When the truth finally came out, Renee's family demanded justice. They wanted Camilla to be held criminally responsible for what she had done for driving their daughter to her death. But they were met with a harsh, frustrating reality. In Australia, as in many parts of the world at the time, there were no laws against catfishing. Creating a fake online persona and using it to deceive someone, even if it leads to devastating psychological harm, was not considered a criminal offense. Because Camilla had not physically forced Renee to jump, she could not be charged with any crime related to her death. Throughout the inquest and the media coverage that followed, Camilla refused to take any responsibility for what happened. She never apologized to Renee's family, and she never showed any remorse for the incredible devastation she had caused. Today, Renee's family is left with a profound, lingering grief and a sense of anger that may never truly fade. They are forced to live with the knowledge that the person who destroyed their daughter's life is walking free, completely unpunished by the law. The story of Renee Marsden is a haunting reminder of the dark side of our connected world. It shows us that the people we think we know, the people we let into our lives and our hearts, can sometimes be the very ones who are plotting our destruction. And it leaves us with the unsettling truth that sometimes the most horrific acts of cruelty can be committed without ever breaking a single law on the books. These three stories, from the miraculous reunion of Michael and Lisa, to the bloody, corrupt empire of Wallace Sousa, and finally to the tragic digital betrayal of Renee Marsden, show us the incredible spectrum of human behavior. They remind us of the power of our actions, the weight of the choices we make, and the enduring, sometimes devastating consequences that follow them. And the third story is the one that people still debate to this day. Because depending on your perspective, it might not even be considered a crime. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you're not ready to stop, there's another story waiting for you right now. We often like to believe that we have a firm grip on the boundaries of our daily lives. We wake up, we follow our routines, and we go to sleep, confident that the world behaves according to a strict set of logical rules. We believe that when a person goes missing, they are simply lost somewhere in the physical world, waiting to be found. We believe that when someone passes away, that is the absolute, definitive end of their story, and their physical body is nothing more than a vessel that has run its course. But today, we are going to look at two incredibly strange cases from East Asia where those very rules of reality seem to bend, shatter, and completely rewrite themselves. The first case takes us to a beautiful but deeply mysterious mountain forest in mainland China in the year 2020, where a woman went on a simple morning walk and stepped directly into a complete blank spot in time. The second case takes us back to a rural village in Taiwan in 1959, where a family had to face a reality so bizarre that even the national government had to launch an official investigation. Both of these stories will leave you questioning what is actually possible in the world we live in and how little we truly understand about the human mind, the human spirit, and the forces that exist just outside our field of vision. To understand our first story, we have to go to a small, quiet village nestled at the foot of a massive mountain range in mainland China. In this village, there lived a 39-year-old woman named Fei. Fei was a very gentle, quiet, and simple person who had lived in this exact village her entire life. She was a familiar face to everyone, but she was also someone who kept to herself. She lived a highly predictable and sheltered existence, and this was not by accident. There was a very specific, deeply personal reason why Fei lived her life with such extreme caution. When she was a much younger woman, Fei had been diagnosed with a serious, life-threatening tumor. The medical journey to treat this tumor was incredibly grueling. She had to undergo intensive therapies and take a cocktail of heavy, physically damaging medications for a very long period of time. Fortunately, the treatment was successful, the tumor went away, and she was declared completely free of the disease. But while her body had recovered, her mind had been deeply impacted by the experience. The long years of feeling sick, visiting doctors, and dealing with the harsh side effects of her medication had instilled a permanent sense of fragility in her. Fei grew up believing that she was incredibly delicate, like a piece of fine porcelain that could easily shatter if she took any unnecessary physical risks. Because of this deeply ingrained fear, Fei developed a lifestyle of absolute caution. She avoided any form of physical exertion, she never played sports, she never traveled to unfamiliar cities, and she absolutely refused to go anywhere near the rugged, steep mountain trails that surrounded her village. While her neighbors and family members would regularly venture up into the mountains to gather wood, pick wild herbs, or simply enjoy the fresh air, Faye remained strictly on the paved, flat roads of her village. She felt that as long as she stayed on the flat ground and followed her familiar path, she would remain safe and healthy. Over the years, this desire for safety turned into a highly disciplined, comforting daily routine. Every single morning, Faye would wake up early, put on her favorite bright red winter coat, and step out of her house. She would walk down the quiet village streets to the local convenience store. There, she would take her time browsing the aisles, eventually purchasing a large assortment of sweet pastries, sesame biscuits, and other small snacks. Once she paid the clerk, she would step back outside and decide which of her relatives she would visit that day. She would walk to her parents' house, her sister's house, or back to the home she shared with her husband. She would spend her afternoon sitting with them, sharing her snacks, chatting about the local gossip, and enjoying the quiet comfort of her family. This was her entire life, and while it kept her safe, it also made her quite isolated. She did not really have any close friends, and she rarely did anything purely for fun. She was simply stuck in her safe, predictable ways. But on the morning of the 16th of February 2020, the weather was exceptionally clear and cool, and Faye got out of bed to start her day just like she had thousands of times before. She slipped her arms into the sleeves of her distinctive bright red coat, zipped it up to her chin, and walked out the door. She made her way to the local convenience store, greeted the cashier, and picked out a large selection of her favorite snacks. After paying, she stepped back out onto the main road, holding her bags of food. As she stood there, enjoying a sweet pastry and trying to decide whether she should go visit her sister or head straight back home, she suddenly heard several voices calling out her name from a short distance away. Faye stopped, turned her head, and looked toward the edge of the paved road. Standing at the very top of a dirt trailhead that led directly up into the mountains were 5 people. They were standing in a small cluster, waving their hands and smiling warmly at her. Faye recognized them as fellow villagers, people she had seen around the neighborhood for years. She could see that they were dressed in sturdy clothing and appeared to be preparing for a hike. The dirt path where they were standing was the entrance to a famous local trail that led up into a massive, dense forest on the mountainside. This forest was incredibly beautiful, filled with towering pine trees, steep rocky cliffs, and pristine natural waterways. It was known locally as the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King. This name came from the fact that there were literally 18 beautiful, natural pools of mountain water scattered throughout the dense woods, fed by rushing streams and spectacular waterfalls. The village where Faye lived sat right at the base of this mountain, and its Chinese name even translated directly to Dragon King. Despite living her entire life next to this breathtaking natural wonder, Faye had never once set foot on that trail. She had heard her family members and neighbors describe how magnificent the waterfalls were and how peaceful the air felt up among the ponds, but her fear of getting hurt or falling ill had always kept her away. It was simply too risky for someone who viewed herself as frail. But on this particular morning, as the 5 villagers called out her name and waved, something unexpected happened inside of Faye. They called out to her saying, "Hey, Faye, come over here, come join us." They told her they were heading up to the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King for a beautiful morning hike, and they wanted her to come along with them. They told her it was a perfect day for a walk, that the mountain air would do her good, and that she should finally experience the beauty of the forest for herself. Normally, Faye would have immediately declined the invitation, made a polite excuse, and hurried back to her safe, predictable routine. But as she stood there looking at their friendly, inviting faces and feeling the warmth of the morning sun, she felt a sudden, unfamiliar spark of excitement. She thought about how repetitive her life had become, how she did the exact same thing every single day, and how she had never once allowed herself to experience the incredible natural beauty that lay just outside her door. She looked at the 5 people and thought to herself that they seemed very competent, kind, and responsible. Surely, if she was hiking with a group of trustworthy neighbors, nothing bad could possibly happen to her. It felt like a perfectly safe, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to finally step out of her comfort zone and do something adventurous. And so, acting on a rare impulse, Faye walked over to the group and told them that she would love to join them. The 5 villagers were absolutely thrilled to have her along, and together, the 6 of them began their hike up the dirt trail. As they walked deeper and deeper into the forest, Faye was completely captivated by what she saw. The landscape was even more stunning than she had ever imagined from her distant view at the bottom. The towering trees filtered the bright sunlight, casting beautiful dancing shadows on the forest floor, and the air smelled incredibly fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Faye felt a deep, overwhelming sense of joy and liberation. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing the natural majesty of her home, and she felt completely alive. The 5 companions were wonderful hiking partners. They chatted amiably, asking Faye about her life and sharing stories of their own. Faye opened up to them, talking about her childhood, her past health struggles, and how much this walk meant to her. The conversation flowed easily, and the miles seemed to fly by as they climbed higher up the mountain. Eventually, the trail led them deep into the heart of the forest, where they reached one of the largest and most beautiful ponds in the entire area. It was a truly magical spot. The trees cleared, allowing the warm, bright sunlight to pour down on a pristine, emerald-green pool of water. A gentle waterfall cascaded down a rocky cliff face, feeding into the pond with a soothing, rushing sound. The group decided that this was the perfect place to stop and rest. They all took a seat right on the rocky shore of the pond, and Faye's companions began to unpack some food. Faye opened up the bags of snacks she had purchased at the convenience store that morning, and together, they enjoyed a wonderful picnic in the warm sunlight. Faye sat there, listening to the sound of the waterfall, eating her snacks, and feeling an incredible sense of peace. She thought to herself that this was easily the best day of her entire life, and she was so glad she had ignored her fears. But as she sat there enjoying the beautiful scene, she suddenly began to feel an intense, overwhelming wave of fatigue. At first, she tried to dismiss it, thinking that it was only natural for her to be tired. After all, she was not used to physical exertion, and she had just hiked several miles up a steep mountain trail. But the fatigue she was feeling was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was not just a pleasant sleepiness, it was a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to pull at her entire body. Her eyes felt incredibly heavy, and she struggled to keep them open. She felt herself slumping backward against the flat rock she was sitting on, her muscles completely losing their strength. She looked over at her 5 companions, hoping to ask them for help or tell them how tired she was. But they were still sitting nearby, eating and talking amongst themselves, seemingly oblivious to her condition. They were not looking at her, and their voices began to sound distant and muffled, as if they were speaking through water. Faye's vision began to blur, and the sunlight reflecting off the pond turned into a hazy, shimmering mist. She tried to fight the urge to sleep, but her body simply refused to cooperate. Her eyelids closed, her head came down onto the cool stone, and she drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep. When Faye finally opened her eyes again, she was still lying in the exact same spot on the rocky shore of the pond. But the warm, bright sunlight was completely gone. The forest was shrouded in pitch-black darkness. The only light came from the cold, pale moon hanging high above the clearing. Faye blinked, trying to clear the heavy fog from her brain, and she slowly sat up. She looked around, expecting to see her companions sleeping nearby or sitting around a campfire. But there was no one there. The shore of the pool was completely empty. The 5 people who had been so kind and attentive to her had vanished without a trace. Faye's heart began to race as a cold dread washed over her. She called out their names, her voice trembling in the dark, but there was no response. The only sounds in the forest were the rushing of the waterfall, the rustling of leaves in the night wind, and the eerie chirping of nocturnal insects. She looked toward the dense tree line, but it was nothing but a wall of black shadows. She could not comprehend how her new friends could have abandoned her like this. They knew she was frail, they knew she had never been up here before, and they knew she did not have a flashlight or any supplies. It made absolutely no sense. Why would they leave her alone in the middle of the wilderness at night? As she sat there shivering in her red coat, her mind began to spiral into absolute panic. She started to think that perhaps this entire day had been a carefully planned trap. Maybe those 5 people had intentionally targeted her, lured her up into the isolated mountains, and slipped something into her food or drink to make her fall asleep. She wondered if they were still out there in the dark, hiding in the shadows, waiting for her to wake up so they could hurt her. The beautiful, majestic forest that had filled her with such joy just hours before now felt incredibly hostile, dangerous, and terrifying. She realized that she was in extreme danger and that she had to get out of there immediately. Faye scrambled to her feet, but her legs were incredibly weak and shaky. She felt a deep, hollow emptiness in her stomach, and her head was spinning. But the adrenaline coursing through her veins pushed her forward. She turned toward the dark path that had brought them to the pond. In the daytime, the path had been clear and easy to follow, but now, under the canopy of trees, it was pitch black. She could not see her own hands in front of her face. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the shadows, embarking on a desperate attempt to find her way back down the mountain. What followed was a living nightmare. Faye stumbled through the pitch-black woods, completely disoriented. She kept losing the trail, stepping off the path and into thick brush and thorny bushes. She tripped over exposed roots and rocks, falling repeatedly and scraping her hands and knees. Every shadow looked like a person waiting to grab her, and every snap of a twig in the distance made her freeze in terror. She was convinced that someone was following her, playing a cruel game of cat and mouse. She walked and crawled for what felt like hours, losing all sense of direction. She was hopelessly lost, terrified, and utterly exhausted. Eventually, as she was stumbling through a particularly dense patch of trees, she came across a small flowing stream. Her throat was incredibly dry, and her body was burning with thirst. She collapsed by the edge of the stream, knelt down, and scooped the cool water into her mouth with her hands. As she sat there, catching her breath and shivering from the cold night air, she noticed that the sky above the tree line was beginning to turn from black to a soft, pale gray. The long, terrifying night was finally coming to an end. As the morning sun began to rise, casting its light through the trees, Faye looked around and realized where she was. To her immense relief, the daylight revealed a clear, well-trodden path just a few yards away from the stream. As she looked down the path, she saw that it wound its way down the side of the mountain, and in the distance she could see the familiar rooftops of her village. She was going to make it. She was going to survive. Faye mustered all of her remaining strength and began her descent down the mountain. As she got closer to the bottom, she looked ahead and saw a large group of people gathered at the trailhead. There were dozens of them, standing together and talking animatedly. Faye felt a massive surge of relief. She assumed that her family had realized she was missing and had organized a search party to come look for her. She began to wave her arms and call out to them, shouting that she was okay and that she was coming down. Some of the people in the crowd heard her voice and looked up the trail. They saw a figure in a bright red coat walking toward them. But instead of cheering or running up to greet her, the crowd fell completely silent. They stood there, frozen, staring up at her with expressions of absolute shock and disbelief. Faye found their reaction very strange, but she was too tired to think much of it. She kept walking, and as she got closer, she recognized many of her friends, neighbors, and family members. Among the crowd was her sister. Faye waved directly at her sister and called out to her, telling her not to worry. Her sister stepped forward, her face pale, and walked toward Faye with hesitant, trembling steps. When they finally reached each other, they fell into a tight embrace. Faye's sister was crying, her body shaking with emotion. Faye held her tight and apologized for causing so much worry. She explained that she had gone for a walk with 5 nice villagers, but she had accidentally fallen asleep at the pond and got lost in the dark. She told her sister that she was incredibly sorry for being so careless, but she was back now and everything was going to be fine. But as Faye spoke, her sister pulled back and stared at her, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and terror. She looked at Faye's gaunt face and her extremely loose clothing. She shook her head and told Faye that what she was saying was impossible. Faye's sister looked her in the eyes and whispered that Faye had not been gone for just one night. She had been missing for 17 days. Faye did not have time to process this shocking revelation because her body finally gave out and she was rushed to the nearest hospital. The medical staff who examined her were absolutely horrified by her physical condition. During the 17 days she had been missing, Faye had lost a staggering 60 pounds. She was severely malnourished, dangerously dehydrated, and her body was on the verge of complete organ failure. The doctors were baffled as to how she was still standing, let alone how she had managed to walk down the mountain on her own. To lose that much weight and survive in the wilderness without food or proper shelter for nearly 3 weeks was a medical miracle. As Faye lay in her hospital bed, slowly recovering, her family and local authorities began to piece together what had happened during her absence. The police showed her security footage from the morning of the 16th of February 2020. Because she was wearing her highly distinctive bright red coat, she was very easy to spot. The footage showed her walking past the convenience store and heading straight toward the trailhead of the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King. But as Faye watched the video, she gasped. The footage clearly showed her walking up the trail entirely by herself. There were no 5 people walking with her. There was no group of friendly villagers chatting and laughing by her side. She was completely alone. Faye was deeply confused and insisted that she had been with 5 specific people. She gave the investigators their names and described their faces and the conversations they had shared. But when her family heard the names, they fell silent and looked at her with pity and fear. They gently explained to Faye that the 5 people she had named were indeed real people who had once lived in their village. However, all 5 of them had passed away many years before. It was physically impossible for Faye to have hiked with them. Furthermore, the authorities explained the scale of the search effort that had taken place while she was gone. Because of these strict pandemic travel restrictions in place at the time, there were guarded checkpoints set up at every single entrance and exit of the surrounding villages. The police knew for a fact that Faye had never left the 7.5-mile forest zone of the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King. They had launched a massive search operation, sending hundreds of volunteers, police officers, and search dogs into the dense woods. They had used thermal imaging drones and had even set off loud fireworks and firecrackers throughout the day and night, hoping that Faye would hear them and walk toward the noise. Yet, during the entire 17 days, Faye had seen absolutely no one, heard no search dogs, and heard no fireworks. From her perspective, she had simply fallen asleep for a few hours in the afternoon and woken up in the dark. There was a massive, inexplicable gap in time that defied all logic. The locals in the village had their own explanation for what had happened to Faye. The forest of the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King was deeply tied to ancient folklore and spiritual beliefs. For generations, the villagers had whispered about the mountain being haunted. Many claimed to have seen strange, glowing blue lights moving silently through the dark trees at night. According to local legend, these lights were the spirits of those who had died on the mountain. These spirits were said to be trapped in the woods, searching for living people to lure into the forest so they could swap places with them, leaving the living trapped in a spiritual realm while the spirit took over their physical form. In fact, the reason the crowd had gathered at the trailhead on the morning of Faye's return was because of these legends. A local villager had looked up at the mountain earlier that morning and saw a bright red light moving slowly through the dark trees. Believing he was witnessing a supernatural phenomenon, he ran back to the village and told everyone. The villagers, excited and terrified, rushed to the trailhead to see the mysterious light for themselves. What they saw was not a ghost light, but Faye in her bright red coat, stepping out of the shadows after 17 days. To this day, there is no logical, scientific explanation for what happened to Faye during those 17 days. Some believe she suffered a severe psychological break, hallucinated the entire experience, and somehow managed to survive in a fugue state in the deep woods. Others believe she stepped into a tear in time or was the victim of something far more supernatural. Faye still lives in the village today, quiet and reserved, and her account of that beautiful hike with her 5 deceased neighbors has never changed. But as strange as Faye's story is, it is not the only event in the region that has challenged our understanding of life, death, and identity. Just a few decades earlier, in the spring of 1959, a similarly inexplicable event occurred in a small rural town in Taiwan. This story begins with a middle-aged civil engineer named Wu Chiu, who was making his usual commute home from work. Wu was a respected and hard-working man who rode his bicycle to and from his job every day. Normally, he quite enjoyed this daily ride. It allowed him to clear his mind, look at the beautiful local temples, and wave to the merchants in the bustling marketplaces. But on this particular morning, Wu was not paying any attention to his surroundings. He was in a state of absolute panic. Earlier that day, he had received an urgent message that his wife had suddenly fallen gravely ill at home. Wu was pedaling his bicycle as fast as his legs could carry him, desperate to reach his house and care for his wife. But as he turned onto the roads of his neighborhood, he began to experience a very strange physical sensation. Even though the road was flat and he was in excellent physical shape, pedaling felt almost impossibly difficult. It felt as though his bicycle was carrying an immense amount of extra weight, as if someone had placed a heavy stone on his back rack or was pulling him from behind. His muscles burned with exhaustion, and he was sweating profusely, struggling to keep the bike moving forward. He could not understand why a simple ride home was taking such a massive toll on his body, but he forced himself to keep going, driven by fear for his wife. As he made his final approach to his street, he saw them as neighbors standing outside. Wu was a deeply polite and neighborly man, so despite his exhaustion and hurry, he took a moment to look at the neighbor and give them a warm wave. But the neighbor did not wave back. Instead, they stared at Wu with a look of intense disgust and hostility. The neighbors scowled, turned their back on him, and walked away. Wu was highly confused by this reaction, but he did not have time to dwell on it. A few moments later, as he got even closer to his house, another neighbor came outside. Once again, Wu tried to be polite, offering a quick greeting as he struggled past. But this neighbor, too, stared at him with complete disdain, as if Wu had committed some horrible, unspeakable crime. The neighbor did not say a word, scoffed, and went back inside their house. Wu was completely bewildered. He had always been on excellent terms with everyone on his street, and he had no idea what he could have possibly done to deserve such treatment. But his wife was his top priority, so he pushed the strange encounters out of his mind, parked his heavy bike, and rushed inside his home. Wu ran into the bedroom and found his wife lying in bed. Her name was Lin Wangyao, and she was 37 years old. Lin had always been a very frail and delicate woman. She was prone to minor illnesses, headaches, and low energy, so Wu was used to taking care of her when she was feeling unwell. But the moment he looked at her face, he knew that this was different. Lin was deathly pale, her skin was slick with sweat, and she was burning up with a terrifyingly high fever. She was completely unresponsive to his voice, only groaning in pain. Wu immediately sprang into action. He rushed to the kitchen to prepare warm tea and light soup, hoping to get some fluids into her. But when he brought the food to her bedside, Lin was too weak to even swallow a single sip. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Throughout the long night, Wu did not sleep. He sat by her side, constantly applying cool cloths to her forehead and praying for her fever to break. But the fever only grew worse, and Lin began to slip in and out of consciousness. Over the next 2 days, the situation became desperate. Lin stopped responding entirely. She did not eat, she did not drink, and she lay completely still, her breathing shallow and ragged. Wu knew that he had to get her to a hospital. But in 1959, in this remote and rural part of Taiwan, getting medical help was a massive challenge. Wu did not own a car, and there were no emergency services to call. The nearest hospital was miles away, and he could not carry his unconscious wife on his bicycle. He remembered that one of his neighbors owned a donkey cart, which was the only form of transport on their street capable of carrying a sick person. Wu ran outside and saw the neighbor standing near the cart. He rushed over, flagging him down, and desperately begged him to use the cart to transport Lin to the hospital. But the neighbor looked at Wu with the exact same expression of disgust and anger that the other neighbors had shown him days before. The neighbor scoffed, turned away, and refused to help. Wu was stunned and furious. He grabbed the neighbor and pleaded with him, explaining that Lin was actively dying and that she would not survive another day without a doctor. When the neighbor heard that Lin's life was truly in imminent danger, his expression softened slightly and his hostility was replaced by a reluctant pity. He agreed to help, and together they went into the house, lifted Lin's limp body, and placed her in the back of the donkey cart. The journey to the hospital was agonizingly slow. It took several hours of bumpy, painful travel for the donkey cart to reach the clinic. By the time they arrived, Lin was completely unresponsive. The doctors and nurses rushed her inside and began doing everything they could to stabilize her. But her body was simply too weak. That night, Lin fell into a deep coma, and shortly after, she was pronounced dead. Wu was absolutely devastated by the loss of his quiet, gentle wife. He and the neighbor loaded her body back onto the donkey cart and made the somber journey back to their village. According to traditional Taiwanese customs, when a loved one passes away, their body is placed in a coffin and kept inside the family home for 7 days. This allows family, friends, and neighbors to visit, pay their respects, and pray for the soul of the deceased before the body is finally cremated. Wu set up the open coffin in his living room and began the painful process of hosting the wake. Over the next few days, a steady stream of mourners came through his doors. Wu sat quietly by the coffin, overwhelmed by grief. As he listened to the people talk about his wife, he realized just how much he was going to miss her. Lin had been a very simple, uneducated woman. She was completely illiterate, never traveled outside of their small region, and was highly introverted. She spent almost all of her time at home, keeping to herself and cooking traditional meals. She was especially known for her delicious pork and beef dishes, which she took great pride in preparing. She was a quiet, comforting presence in his life, and the thought of living in their quiet home without her was unbearable. On the third day of the wake, the living room was crowded with visitors. The atmosphere was heavy with the smell of burning incense and the sound of quiet weeping. Wu sat with his head in his hands, lost in his own sorrow. But suddenly, the quiet murmuring in the room stopped. A sudden, heavy silence fell over the entire house. Then, someone in the room let out a sharp, terrified gasp. Within seconds, multiple people began crying out in shock, some of them backing away toward the front door in pure terror. Wu looked up, confused by the sudden commotion. He saw that the mourners were all staring at the open coffin with wide, terrified eyes. Wu turned his gaze to the coffin, and his heart nearly stopped. Lin, who had been officially pronounced dead by doctors 3 days prior, and whose cold, lifeless body had been lying in a coffin this entire time, was suddenly sitting completely upright. She was blinking her eyes, looking around the crowded room with a look of mild confusion. For a moment, Wu was frozen in place. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. He thought that perhaps the hospital doctors had made a catastrophic error. He thought that maybe his wife had not actually died, but had instead fallen into an incredibly deep, catatonic state that mimicry death so perfectly that no one could detect a pulse. He believed that she had simply woken up from this deep coma. But even as he thought this, a part of him knew how impossible it was. He had been by her side for 3 days. Her body had been cold, stiff, and completely lifeless. She had not breathed, she had not moved, and she had gone without a single drop of water or food for days. But as the initial shock began to wear off, the natural human instinct to help took over. Wu and several of the braver mourners rushed to the side of the coffin. They gently lifted Lynn out of the wooden box and carried her back to her bedroom, laying her down on the mattress. Lynn was incredibly weak and could not speak, but she pointed to her throat, gesturing that she was thirsty. Wu quickly brought her a cup of water, which she drank slowly. Everyone in the room was in a state of utter bewilderment. They told Wu that they needed to get her back to the hospital immediately. But Wu looked at his wife's fragile form and shook his head. He knew how brutal the journey in the donkey cart had been, and he was terrified that moving her now would kill her. He decided that she was far too weak to travel, and that the best course of action was to keep her in bed, keep her comfortable, and pray that she would gain enough strength over the next few days to be safely moved. Over the course of that afternoon and evening, Wu and his family members stayed by her bedside, watching her closely. And then, something truly miraculous began to happen. Instead of remaining weak and frail, Lynn began to recover at an impossibly rapid pace. Within just a few hours, the color returned to her cheeks. Her breathing became strong and steady, and she began to sit up and move her limbs with an ease she had never possessed before. By the time night fell, Lynn was not only sitting up, but she was talking, laughing, and acting as if she had never been sick at all. In fact, she seemed to have far more physical energy and vitality than she had ever shown in her entire life. It was a complete medical impossibility, but Wu was simply too overjoyed to care. His wife was alive, and she was healthy. But the next morning, the joy began to turn into a deep, unsettling confusion. Lynn woke up early, full of energy. She got out of bed, stretched, and told Wu that she wanted to go for a long walk. She wanted to visit the local temple and walk through the town. Wu was hesitant, but seeing how healthy she looked, he agreed. The two of them stepped outside and began their walk. As they walked down the street, Wu found himself struggling to keep up with her. Lynn was walking at an incredibly brisk, athletic pace, her steps light and energetic. This was highly unusual, as Lynn had always walked slowly and delicately due to her frail health. But that was only the beginning of the strangeness. As they encountered neighbors on the street, Lynn would stop and greet them. But as Wu listened to his wife speak, a chill ran down his spine. The voice coming out of her mouth did not sound like Lynn's voice. The tone, the cadence, and the pronunciation were completely different. Most notably, she spoke with a distinct, heavy regional accent from a completely different province of Taiwan, an accent that Lynn had never used and had never been exposed to. Over the next few weeks, the changes in Lynn became impossible to ignore. She was a completely different person in every imaginable way. The first major shock came when Lynn sat down at the kitchen table, picked up a newspaper, and began reading it aloud. Before her illness, Lynn had been entirely illiterate. She had never gone to school, and she could not read or write a single character. Yet here she was, reading complex newspaper articles with perfect ease. Not only could she read, but she also began speaking fluent, formal Mandarin. In 1959, many rural Taiwanese villagers only spoke local dialects, and Lynn had never known a word of Mandarin. Now, she spoke it with the precision of an educated professional. The second change was her diet and her behavior in the kitchen. Lynn had always been an exceptional cook who loved preparing rich meat dishes for her husband. But after her recovery, she refused to touch meat. She declared that she was a strict vegetarian and that the very smell of cooking meat made her feel ill. She stopped cooking her signature dishes entirely, choosing instead to eat only simple vegetables and grains. Furthermore, this quiet, introverted, and submissive woman was now highly outspoken, confident, and sharp-witted. She began talking with incredible detail and authority about complex subjects like business, accounting, and bookkeeping topics that the original Lynn had absolutely no knowledge of. One afternoon, Lynn sat Wu down and told him that he was wasting his talents working as a civil engineer. She analyzed the local economy with incredible precision and told him that there was a massive, untapped demand for construction supplies in their growing town. She strongly advised him to quit his stable job, take their savings, and open a building materials business. She offered to manage the books and handle the financial accounting herself. Wu was terrified of taking such a massive risk, But his wife spoke with such absolute confidence and authority that he found himself agreeing to her plan. He quit his job and opened the shop. To his absolute amazement, Lin's business instincts were flawless. She took over the accounting, managing the finances with professional efficiency. The business became incredibly successful, and they soon began earning far more money than they ever had before. The story of the woman who rose from the dead and became a brilliant Mandarin-speaking businesswoman spread like wildfire. It became the talk of the entire region, and eventually rumors of this miraculous transformation reached the highest levels of the Taiwanese government. The authorities were deeply skeptical of the supernatural rumors, suspecting that some kind of fraud or psychological trickery was taking place. They decided that they needed to conduct an official investigation to uncover the truth. On the 17th of March, 1962, 3 years after her miraculous awakening, the government officially summoned Lin for questioning. Lin, who was completely unfazed by the government's interest, agreed to go. She was brought to a highly secure military hospital, where she was scheduled to be examined and interviewed by the hospital's chief physician, a highly respected and skeptical military doctor. The chief physician sat in his examination room waiting for the patient. He had read the reports and believed that this was likely a case of severe dissociative identity disorder or a highly elaborate hoax. He was prepared to ask tough, analytical questions to expose the truth. The door opened and Lin walked into the room. She looked like an ordinary, middle-aged village woman. But the moment her eyes met the chief physician's face, she stopped in her tracks. A look of profound recognition washed over her face. She smiled warmly, stepped toward him, and addressed him as Uncle. The chief physician was completely taken aback. He frowned and asked her why she was calling him Uncle, as he had never met her or anyone from her village before. But Lin did not back down. She began speaking to him with incredible familiarity, referencing private family matters and personal details that no stranger could possibly know. The doctor's skepticism began to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of shock. He immediately picked up the telephone and called his wife, asking her to come to the hospital right away without explaining why. An hour later, the doctor's wife arrived at the examination room. She had never met Lin, and she had no idea what this meeting was about. But the moment she walked through the door, Lin looked at her, smiled, and called her Auntie. It was then that Lin sat the couple down and revealed the unbelievable truth. She told them that the body they were looking at belonged to Lin Wangyao, but the spirit living inside of it did not. She explained that her real name was Zhu Shua. The chief physician and his wife gasped. Zhu Shua was the name of their beloved niece. Zhu Shua had been a young, highly educated woman who worked as a bookkeeper. During the chaos of the Chinese Civil War, a year prior to Lin's illness, Zhu Shua had attempted to flee to safety. However, she had gone missing during her journey, and her family had never heard from her again. They had searched for her desperately, but they eventually had to accept the tragic reality that she was likely dead. They had never found her body, and they had never received any closure. Lin, or rather the spirit of Zhu Shua speaking through Lin's body, began to detail exactly what had happened to her. She explained that during her escape, she had been cornered on a beach by a group of local fishermen. The fishermen had robbed her of all her money and belongings, and then, to cover up their crime, they had brutally murdered her and cast her body into the sea. Zhu Shua explained that after her physical death, her soul had been trapped in a state of purgatory, wandering the earthly realm in confusion and grief. She had been unable to move on, anchored by the injustice of her death. But then, she felt a powerful pull toward a specific house in a nearby village. She had followed that pull and found Lin Wangyao lying in her bed, her physical body dying of a terrible fever. When Lin's spirit finally left her body and passed on to the afterlife, the physical body was left vacant but still viable. Zhu Shua's spirit, seeing an opportunity to return to the living world and seek justice, stepped into the vacant vessel. She revived the cold body, woke up in the coffin, and had been living as Lin ever since. The chief physician and his wife listened to this story in absolute silence, tears streaming down their faces. As they looked at the woman sitting before them, they realized that her accent, her mannerisms, her posture, and the way she held her hands were identical to their missing niece. This woman possessed all of Zhu Shua's knowledge, her literacy, her fluency in Mandarin, her bookkeeping skills, and her strict vegetarian diet. It was a perfect match. But the chief physician knew that the government would never accept a spiritual explanation without concrete, verifiable proof. He realized that there was one way to test her story. Zhu Shua had claimed that she was murdered by a specific group of local fishermen, and she had even provided the government investigators with their names and the exact location of the crime. The Taiwanese government launched an official investigation into the disappearance of Zhu Shua based on Lin's testimony. They tracked down the names of the fishermen she had provided. To their surprise, they found that almost all of them had already passed away in the years since the war. However, there was one surviving fisherman still living in a quiet coastal village. The police went to the fisherman's home and brought him in for questioning. They did not tell him about Lin or the claims of reincarnation. They simply asked him about the missing young woman from years ago. At first, the old fisherman was defensive. But as the police pressed him with specific details of the crime, details that had never been made public, the man broke down. He wept and confessed to the crime. He admitted that his group of fishermen had indeed cornered, robbed, and murdered the young woman on the beach. But then, the fisherman added a detail that sent chills down the investigators' spines. He told the police that during the attack, he had felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. He had tried to stand up to the other fishermen and begged them to spare the girl's life, but they had ignored him and proceeded with the murder anyway. This exact detail that one of the fishermen had tried to save her was something that Lin had specifically told the investigators during her interview at the military hospital. There was absolutely no way for an illiterate village woman living miles away to have known this private, decades-old secret. Based on the fisherman's confession and the incredible consistency of the details, the Taiwanese government officially closed the case of Zhu Shua's disappearance. They updated her status from missing to murdered, and they officially recorded the deceased fishermen as her killers. The government, a highly bureaucratic and skeptical institution, had essentially solved a cold case murder using the testimony of a reincarnated spirit. But there was still one lingering mystery from the very beginning of the story. When Wu Chu had been riding his bicycle home on the day his wife fell ill, he had been deeply hurt by the hostile reactions of his neighbors. He had not understood why they had looked at him with such intense disgust. During the government's investigation, the investigators interviewed those exact neighbors to get their perspective on the events. When asked about that day, the neighbors explained that they had been absolutely outraged by Wu's behavior. They told the police that they all knew Lin Wangyao was lying in bed, desperately ill and close to death. Yet, as they stood outside their homes, they saw Wu Chu pedaling down the street, sweating and struggling. And sitting directly on the back rack of his bicycle was a young, unfamiliar woman. The woman was holding on to his waist, riding along with him. To the neighbors, it appeared that Wu Chu was flagrantly parading his mistress through the street while his devoted wife lay dying in their home. It was an act of supreme disrespect and cruelty, which is why they had looked at him with such utter disdain and refused to wave back. But Wu Chu had sworn under oath that he was completely alone on his bicycle that day. He had not been carrying any passenger. However, he did vividly remember that the bicycle had felt incredibly, inexplicably heavy, as if he was carrying an extra 100 pounds of weight up the flat road. According to Lin, or Zhu Shua, the mystery was simple. Zhu Shua's spirit had been drawn to Wu's house that morning, knowing that Lin's body would soon become available. As Wu was riding home in a panic, her spirit had hitched a ride on the back of his bicycle. Because spirits are invisible to those who are not spiritually sensitive, Wu could not see her, though he could feel her physical weight. But the neighbors, perhaps due to the strange spiritual energy surrounding the impending transition, had briefly seen the form of a young woman riding on the back of the bike. For the rest of her long life, Lin Wangyao lived as Zhu Shua. She never returned to her old personality, her old diet, or her illiteracy. She remained a sharp, confident, and highly respected member of her community, acting as a spiritual guide and counselor for many who sought her wisdom. She and Wu Chu lived a long, prosperous life together, running their successful business. Zhu Shua passed away in the year 2018 at the remarkable age of 97. At her funeral, the family hung beautiful ceremonial banners that displayed both of her names, Lin Wangyao and Zhu Shua. It was a final, respectful acknowledgement of the two lives that had shared a single physical vessel. These two extraordinary stories, occurring decades apart in different regions, present us with a profound mystery. In the case of Faye, we have a woman who vanished into a heavily monitored forest, only to return 17 days later, having lost 60 pounds, with a completely altered perception of time and memories of hiking with the dead. In the case of Lin Wangyao, we have a woman who officially died, only to sit up in her coffin 3 days later, speaking a different language, possessing advanced professional skills, and carrying the memories of a murdered stranger whose killers she was able to identify with perfect accuracy. Are these events the result of rare, extreme psychological phenomena that science has yet to fully map? Or did these two women truly step across the invisible boundaries that separate our physical reality from something far more mysterious, vast, and unexplained? We may never know the absolute truth, but the documented evidence, the police records, and the lives of the people involved suggest that the world we live in is far more mysterious than we could ever begin to imagine. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time!